I watched my husband smirk in the courtroom with his arm draped casually over the back of his mistress's chair. "You will never touch my money again," he whispered, his voice dripping with an arrogance that echoed in the quiet space. She leaned in her fake diamonds, catching the fluorescent light, adding that I did not deserve a single dime of his hard-earned wealth. I did not argue, I did not cry. I simply waited for the judge to open the sealed envelope I had submitted to the clerk that very morning. The entire courtroom went dead silent as the judge scanned the first page of my dossier. He adjusted his glasses, looked down at my husband's smug face, and let out a loud, genuine laugh. "Oh, this is good," the judge said softly, the amusement clear in his voice. In less than 3 seconds, the color drained completely from my husband's face, and the fake empire he thought he controlled began to burn to the ground. The end of my marriage did not start in a courtroom. It started at a $10,000 table in the middle of a ballroom in downtown Atlanta. The annual charity gala was the kind of event where the city's black elite gathered to showcase their wealth, their influence, and their perfectly curated lives. I was 35 years old, wearing a custom emerald gown that draped perfectly over my frame, sitting quietly while the room buzzed with the clinking of crystal glasses and the hum of strategic networking. I was the wife of Terrence Thornton, the charismatic chief executive officer of a luxury real estate development firm. For a decade, I had played my part flawlessly. I smiled when required, I hosted the right dinners, and I stood quietly in the background while Terrence soaked up the spotlight. But that night, Terrence was not standing with me. He had abandoned me at our table before the first course was even served. Instead of networking with the investors we desperately needed to impress, he was across the ballroom openly flaunting his new executive assistant, Jasmine. Jasmine was 26, wearing a dress that was entirely inappropriate for a formal philanthropic event, and laughing entirely too loudly at everything Terrence said. She clung to his arm, tossing her hair and looking around the room with a sense of entitlement that frankly insulted the intelligence of everyone present. She was blinded by the illusion of his wealth, mesmerized by the tailored suits and the leased luxury cars, completely unaware of the reality behind the curtain. I watched them from across the room, feeling the sympathetic and pitying stares of the other wives at my table. In the wealthy circles of Atlanta, perception is everything. You do not air your dirty laundry in public, and you certainly do not disrespect your wife in a room full of people who control your funding. I excused myself from the table, my posture perfectly straight, and glided across the ballroom. I did not storm over. I did not cause a scene. I approached Terrence quietly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, projecting the image of a supportive partner. "Terrence," I said, keeping my voice low and modulated so only he could hear. "The board members from the investment group are watching us. We are supposed to be representing a united front for this capital raise. You need to send your assistant home and sit at our table." Terrence pulled away from my touch as if I had burned him. His jaw tightened, and the charming smile he reserved for the public vanished, replaced by a cold, condescending glare. Jasmine rolled her eyes and took a sip of her champagne, leaning closer into his personal space. Terrence leaned down, his voice dropping into a harsh, venomous whisper that cut straight through the music and the chatter of the ballroom. "Do not embarrass me, Maya," he snapped, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tuxedo. "You do not tell me what to do or who I can associate with. You are lucky my last name even gives a woman like you access to this room. Learn your place." The words hung in the air between us, sharp and deliberate. He wanted to break me. He wanted me to shrink away, embarrassed by my working-class roots, ashamed that I had not been born into generational wealth like the other women in the room. Jasmine let out a soft, mocking giggle, looking me up and down, as if I were the help who had overstepped her boundaries. Any other wife might have cried. Any other woman might have thrown her drink in his face or fled the ballroom in tears. But I am not any other woman. I am a senior forensic accountant. I track hidden assets and dismantle offshore embezzlement rings for high-profile federal cases. I spend my days tearing apart the financial structures of corrupt billionaires. I did not cry. I simply looked at Terrence, took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, and smiled. He thought his last name gave me access. He had completely forgotten that I was the architect who built the foundation of his entire company. 10 years ago, when he was just a man with a dream and terrible credit, I was the one who structured his corporate tax entities. I was the one who navigated the legal loopholes to get his first business loan approved. He thought he was untouchable because he was standing in a room full of millionaires. He did not realize that I knew exactly where every single penny of his money was buried. I turned around and walked out of the ballroom, leaving my barely touched champagne on a passing waiter's tray. The valet brought my car around, and I drove out of the city, the cool night air rushing through my open windows. I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The facade of my marriage was finally dropping, and the clarity that replaced it was intoxicating. I drove back to our sprawling estate in Buckhead, fully prepared to pack a bag and stay at a hotel until we could negotiate the terms of our separation like rational adults. When I pulled through the wrought iron gates of our property, the motion sensor lights flooded the driveway, illuminating a scene that made me stop the car in its tracks. Stacked haphazardly on the pristine cobblestone driveway were my designer suitcases, several cardboard boxes, and a trash bag filled with my clothes. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my heels, and walked up to the massive double front doors. I slipped my key into the lock, but it would not turn. He had changed the locks. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out to find a text message from Terrence. Taking a break. Jasmine is moving in tonight. My lawyers will send you a modest allowance to cover your basic needs. Do not make a scene and do not try to break into my house. I stood on the porch of the multi-million-dollar home I had helped finance, looking at my belongings discarded like garbage. He was evicting me from my own life to move his mistress into my bed. He expected me to panic. He expected me to bang on the heavy wooden doors, to scream and cry and beg for entry so his security cameras could capture me looking like an unstable, hysterical woman. He wanted evidence to use against me in the divorce. Instead, I took a deep breath, walked back to my car, and sat in the driver's seat. I locked the doors, turned on the interior lights, and pulled my laptop from my work bag. I connected to my mobile hotspot, the blue glow of the screen illuminating my face in the dark driveway. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Elias answered on the second ring. My mentor was a 60-year-old veteran of financial investigations, a man who had taught me everything I knew about dismantling corporate fraud. He knew my husband was arrogant, but he also knew I never called him this late unless a situation required absolute, ruthless precision. Elias, I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. Terrence just locked me out of the house. He moved his assistant in and told me his lawyers are putting me on an allowance. There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Elias let out a long, slow breath. I warned you about him, Maya. The man is a walking liability. What do you need me to do? Do you need a place to stay? Do you want me to call the partners and get you a legal team? I do not need a place to stay, I replied, my fingers already flying across my keyboard. I need you to authorize my remote access to the firm's private servers. I need to run a trace, and I need it to stay off the official company logs until I know exactly what I'm looking at. Maya Elias warned, his tone shifting into protective mode. If you use company resources for a personal domestic dispute, HR will have my head in yours. You know the protocols. This is not a domestic dispute, Elias. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. This is a preliminary financial audit. Terrence is arrogant, but he is not stupid enough to kick me out of our primary residence unless he is desperate. Something is wrong with his money. I need clearance. You have 48 hours, Elias said quietly. Do not leave a digital footprint you cannot justify to a judge. I hung up the phone and cracked my knuckles. Terrence thought he was playing a game of social status and intimidation. He was about to learn what happens when you wage war against someone who reads bank routing numbers like a second language. 10 years ago, when Terrence was launching his luxury development firm, I built his entire digital infrastructure. I coded the routing paths for his offshore holding companies, set up the encrypted tax shelters, and designed the administrative hierarchy for his servers. Over the years, as his company grew and he hired expensive external IT teams to manage his systems, they upgraded the software, but they never rebuilt the foundational architecture. They never realized that the original architect had buried a top-tier administrative backdoor deep within the network code, a backdoor that belonged exclusively to me. My fingers danced across the keyboard, bypassing the two-factor authentication and slicing through the corporate firewalls like a hot knife through butter. Within 3 minutes, I was inside the central nervous system of his entire business empire. I did not waste my time looking at our joint personal checking accounts. I knew he would have already drained those or restricted my access. I bypassed the domestic retail accounts and went straight for the jugular. I accessed his primary commercial development fund, the massive pool of capital he used to secure real estate acquisitions and pay his luxury contractors. The screen loaded populating rows of digital ledgers and transaction histories. I navigated to the bottom line, waiting for the total available balance to calculate. I expected to see a few $1 million, perhaps slightly depleted from his recent lavish spending sprees with Jasmine. Instead, the number glowed in bright, glaring red. The commercial development fund was not flourishing. It was not even stagnant. The account was overdrawn by $100,000. I sat back in my leather seat, staring at the screen as the reality of the situation washed over me. Terrence was completely, undeniably broke. The luxury cars, the custom suits, the $10,000 charity tables, all of it was a fragile house of cards, built on massive, unmanageable debt. He was not kicking me out of the Buckhead estate because he was a powerful, untouchable king making room for his new queen. He was kicking me out because the walls were closing in, and he needed to secretly liquidate the marital estate to save himself from total financial ruin. He needed me out of the house so I would not see the foreclosure notices arriving in the mail. He needed me distracted by a messy divorce so I would not look at his commercial ledgers. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The sheer audacity of his plan was almost impressive, but his execution was fundamentally flawed. He had picked a fight with the one person on the planet equipped to dismantle him piece by piece. I safely logged out of the server, leaving zero trace of my entry. I closed my laptop, placed it carefully back into my bag, and started the engine of my car. I did not look back at the dark, looming house or my discarded luggage. I drove straight to the Ritz-Carlton downtown, pulled up to the valet, and booked their best available corner suite using a private offshore account Terrence knew absolutely nothing about. As the bellhop carried my bags up to the penthouse, I ordered a bottle of expensive red wine from room service. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Terrence wanted a war over assets, and I was going to make sure he lost every single battle. I am Maya, 35 years old, and currently standing in the wreckage of a marriage I spent 10 years building. As a senior forensic accountant, I dismantle corporate fraud for a living, but I completely missed the embezzlement happening in my own home. Last night, my husband Terrence abandoned me at a charity gala to openly flaunt his 26-year-old assistant. When I drove home, I found my designer luggage stacked in the driveway and the locks changed. He texted me that he was moving his mistress in and putting me on an allowance. I did not cry. I simply opened my laptop and triggered a financial trap he never saw coming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant partner exactly who holds the power. The drive back to our estate in Buckhead was suffocatingly quiet. The heavy Georgia humidity pressed against the windows of my car, but the chill inside my chest had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I had just left a ballroom full of Atlanta's most influential investors and socialites, walking out with my head held high after Terrence told me to learn my place. He had actually believed that his sharp tone and his tailored tuxedo would make me shrink into myself. He thought I would cower to protect the flawless image of Black excellence we had spent a decade carefully curating for magazine covers and charity boards. But as my tires crunched against the familiar gravel of our long, sweeping driveway, the last remnants of my role as the dutiful, supportive wife completely evaporated. The motion sensor lights flooded the pristine landscaping, casting a harsh, glaring illumination across the front of the house. I stopped my car abruptly. There, sitting haphazardly on the cobblestone directly in front of the massive double oak doors, was my entire life packed into bags. 5 pieces of vintage designer luggage, the exact set Terrence had purchased for me when he landed his first major real estate development deal, were stacked like discarded garbage. Beside them sat 2 taped cardboard boxes and a plastic trash bag overflowing with my custom-tailored suits and silk blouses. I put the car in park and stepped out into the night air. The sheer audacity of the visual struck me before the emotional reality did. He had not just asked for a divorce. He had not requested mediation or suggested we spend some time apart to evaluate our future. He had systematically gathered my belongings while I was attempting to secure funding for his company, thrown them into the driveway, and locked me out of the home I had meticulously decorated and partially financed. I walked slowly up the stone steps, my heels clicking sharply in the dead silence of the neighborhood. I pulled my house key from my clutch and slipped it into the brass lock. It refused to turn. I tried again, applying a bit more pressure, but the mechanism was completely different. He had actually called a locksmith while I was drinking champagne with his board members. A sharp vibration in my hand drew my attention away from the door. I looked down at my phone screen. A text message from Terrence had just come through. The timing was too perfect, meaning he was likely watching me on the doorbell camera right now, waiting for me to break down. I opened the message and read the words that would ultimately seal his total destruction. Taking a break. Jasmine is moving in tonight. My lawyers will send you a modest allowance to cover your basic needs. Do not make a scene and do not try to break into my house. I read the text twice, letting the absolute delusion of his words wash over me. My house. Modest allowance. Do not make a scene. He was speaking to me as if I were a dependent child, a charity case he had graciously allowed to occupy his space. He wanted a reaction. He was practically begging for the stereotypical narrative. He wanted me to scream, to pound my fists against the heavy oak doors, to throw a patio chair through the front window so he could call the police and paint me as the unstable, angry wife who could not handle the end of our marriage. He wanted to use my pain as leverage in the divorce proceedings to secure his assets and protect his reputation. I did not give him the satisfaction. I did not shed a single tear. I looked directly up at the small, blinking red light of the security camera mounted above the doorframe. I offered a calm, chillingly pleasant smile, gave a small wave, and turned my back on the house. I walked down the steps with absolute precision, ignoring the luggage and the boxes entirely. Those were just material things easily replaced. I returned to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. The transition happening in my mind was instantaneous. The supportive wife who overlooked his late nights and excused his financial secrecy was dead. In her place sat the ruthless professional that federal agencies hired to track down missing millions. I reached into my leather work tote and pulled out my laptop. I set it on the passenger seat, booted it up, and immediately connected it to my encrypted mobile hotspot. The soft blue glow of the screen illuminated the dark interior of my car. For a decade, I had separated my professional skills from my personal life. I audited corrupt politicians, dismantled fraudulent shell companies, and traced offshore embezzlement for high-profile federal cases. I was a senior forensic accountant, trained to find the money that powerful men tried desperately to hide. I had never turned that lens on my own husband, choosing instead to trust the man I married. That trust was a massive miscalculation, but it was one I was about to rectify. Before I initiated any tracking software, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had memorized years ago. The phone rang 3 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Elias. I said, my voice dangerously calm. I need a favor, and I need it completely off the official record for the next 48 hours. My mentor let out a long, heavy sigh on the other end of the line. Elias was a veteran investigator, a man who had navigated the murky waters of financial crime for over 30 years. He had taken me under his wing when I was just a hungry junior analyst, teaching me how to think like a criminal in order to catch one. Maya, he said, his tone instantly shifting into a cautious, protective register. It is 11 o'clock at night. You are using your emergency tone. Tell me what is going on. Terrence just locked me out of our estate, I stated plainly, keeping my eyes fixed on the illuminated screen of my laptop. He abandoned me at the charity gala, moved his 26-year-old assistant into my bedroom, and sent me a text message informing me that his lawyers will be putting me on a modest allowance. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Elias had never liked Terrence. He had always warned me that Terrence was too flashy, too concerned with outward appearances, and too evasive about his operational costs. "I am sending a car for you right now," Elias said firmly. "Go to a hotel. Do not engage with him. I will have the firm's best divorce attorneys on the phone by tomorrow morning. We will freeze his domestic accounts before he can even buy that girl breakfast." "I do not need a divorce attorney yet, Elias." I rested my fingers on the keyboard, bringing up the secure terminal portal I used for federal audits. "I need you to authorize my remote access to the firm's private investigative servers. I need to run a trace on his holding company, and I need the firm's tracking footprint masked." "Maya, no." Elias's voice grew sharp with warning. "You know the protocols. If you use agency resources to conduct an unauthorized audit for a personal domestic dispute, human resources will have my head on a platter, and you will lose your security clearance. You cannot cross that line." "This is not a domestic dispute," I countered, my voice dropping an octave. "Listen to me, Elias. Terrence is arrogant, but he is a calculated man. He cares about his image in the black business community more than he cares about breathing. He would never initiate a messy public lockout and move a mistress into our primary residence unless he was completely desperate. He is trying to force a swift, chaotic divorce. He wants me distracted by the humiliation and the fight over the house." Why, Elias asked, his investigative instincts clearly catching up with my logic. "Because something is fundamentally wrong with his money." I explained, my fingers hovering over the enter key. 10 years ago, when he was just starting out, I built his entire corporate tax structure. I set up the routing paths for his development funds. I know the architecture of his network better than his own IT department does because I laid the foundation. If he is initiating a rapid liquidation of our marriage, it means he is hiding a massive financial hemorrhage. I need server clearance." "Elias, now." The line was silent for several long seconds. I could hear the distant sound of city traffic through his phone as he weighed the professional risk against his trust in my instincts. "You have top-tier administrative access to his network," Elias finally asked, his tone shifting from mentor to co-conspirator. "I left a back door in his server code a decade ago," I confirmed, a cold smile touching my lips. "He thinks I am just a woman crying in his driveway. He forgot who handles the math." "You have 24 hours, Elias said quietly. "I will mask the ping on our end. But Maya, if you open his ledgers and find what I think you are going to find, you cannot use it just to hurt him. You have to destroy him legally. Leave no digital footprint you cannot justify to a federal judge. I will not leave a trace, I promised." "Thank you, Elias." I disconnected the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. The emotional fog that had threatened to consume me back in the ballroom was completely gone. Terrence wanted to reduce me to a weeping, discarded wife. He wanted to strip away my dignity and force me to beg for an allowance from the wealth I had helped him accumulate. I took a deep breath, cracked my knuckles, and stared at the command prompt on my screen. He had waged war against the wrong woman. I disconnected the call with Elias and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. The emotional fog that had threatened to consume me back in the ballroom was completely gone. Terrence wanted to reduce me to a weeping, discarded wife. He wanted to strip away my dignity and force me to beg for an allowance from the wealth I had helped him accumulate. I took a deep breath, cracked my knuckles, and stared at the command prompt on my screen. He had waged war against the wrong woman. The glow of my laptop screen cast a pale blue light across the leather interior of my car. Outside, the sprawling mansions of Buckhead sat quiet and imposing, hiding their own secrets behind manicured hedges and wrought iron gates. Our house stood just yards away, a massive stone structure that I had spent years turning into a home. Terrence was inside right now, likely pouring a glass of my expensive scotch for his assistant, congratulating himself on a clean break. He probably thought he had executed a masterstroke of manipulation. He believed that the shock of the lockout combined with the public humiliation at the charity gala would leave me entirely shattered. He anticipated weeks of me crying to lawyers fighting desperately for my share of the marital assets while he held all the cards. He was wrong. Terrence always had a fatal flaw. He confused visibility with power. He thought because his name was on the building and his face was on the magazines, he was the one running the empire. But a kingdom does not stand without its architect. 10 years ago, when Terrence was just a man with a charming smile and a mountain of student debt, I was the one who built the foundation of his real estate firm. We sat at a scratched dining table in a cramped apartment, and I meticulously designed his entire corporate tax structure. I set up the routing paths for his development funds. I navigated the complex legal loopholes required to get his first commercial loan approved. I coded the encrypted tax shelters and designed the administrative hierarchy for his servers. Over the years, as his company grew and he hired expensive external tech teams to manage his systems, they updated the software and changed the passwords. But they never rebuilt the foundational architecture. They never realized that the original architect had buried a top-tier administrative backdoor deep within the network code, a backdoor that belonged exclusively to me. My fingers danced across the keyboard. I bypassed the two-factor authentication protocols his expensive security team had installed. I sliced through the corporate firewalls without triggering a single alarm. Within 3 minutes, I was inside the central nervous system of his entire business empire. I did not waste my time looking at our joint personal checking accounts. I knew he would have already drained those or restricted my access. I knew Jasmine had likely been swiping his personal black card for months to buy those cheap-looking designer knockoffs she loved so much. I bypassed the domestic retail accounts entirely and went straight for the jugular. I accessed his primary commercial development fund. This was the massive pool of capital he used to secure real estate acquisitions, pay his luxury contractors, and maintain the illusion of his limitless wealth. It was the lifeblood of his company. The screen loaded, populating endless rows of digital ledgers and transaction histories. I navigated to the bottom line, waiting for the total available balance to calculate. I expected to see a few $1 million, perhaps slightly depleted from his recent lavish spending sprees. I expected to see the comfortable cushion of a successful developer who simply wanted to upgrade his wife for a younger model. Instead, the number glowed in bright, glaring red. The commercial development fund was not flourishing. It was not even stagnant. The account was overdrawn by $100,000. I sat back in my leather seat, staring at the screen as the reality of the situation washed over me. I ran the diagnostic again, assuming there might be a pending transfer or a delayed deposit. The result remained identical, a sea of red numbers. Terrence was completely undeniably broke. The luxury cars, the custom suits, the $10,000 charity tables. All of it was a fragile house of cards, built on massive, unmanageable debt. I clicked through the recent transaction history. He had been bleeding money for months. Properties were over-leveraged. Contractors were being paid late or not at all. He had been moving funds frantically between shell companies to cover the margins, creating a dizzying maze of financial desperation. Suddenly, the entire evening made perfect, crystal-clear sense. He was not kicking me out of the Buckhead estate because he was a powerful, untouchable king, making room for his new queen. He was doing it because the walls were closing in, and he needed to secretly liquidate the marital estate to save himself from total financial ruin. If we went through a standard amicable divorce, the courts would require a full discovery of assets. His investors would find out he was insolvent. His creditors would descend like vultures. He needed me out of the house immediately, so I would not see the foreclosure notices arriving in the mail. He needed me distracted by a messy, emotional divorce, so I would not look closely at his commercial ledgers. He needed me to be the hysterical, discarded wife, fighting over furniture and alimony, completely blind to the fact that there was no money left to fight over. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The sheer audacity of his plan was almost impressive, but his execution was fundamentally flawed. He had picked a fight with the one person on the planet equipped to dismantle him piece by piece. He thought he could bury me under his debt and walk away clean with a younger woman. He thought I would quietly accept a modest allowance while he sold the home I helped finance to cover his fraudulent business practices. I safely logged out of the server, carefully erasing any digital residue of my presence. I left zero trace of my entry, just as I had promised Elias. I closed my laptop, placed it carefully back into my leather tote, and started the engine of my car. I did not look back at the dark, looming house. I did not spare a single glance for my discarded designer luggage sitting on the cobblestones. Those were just material things easily replaced by a woman who knew her own worth. I pulled out of the driveway and navigated the winding, tree-lined streets of Buckhead, leaving my old life behind in the rearview mirror. I drove straight downtown, pulling up to the valet stand of the Ritz-Carlton. The attendant rushed to open my door, his professional smile a welcome contrast to the disrespect I had endured all evening. I grabbed my work bag and walked into the lobby, projecting an aura of absolute unbothered calm. I approached the front desk and booked their best available corner suite. When the concierge asked for a method of payment, I did not hand him a card tied to Terrence. I handed him a heavy metal card linked to a private offshore account I had established years ago. An account Terrence knew absolutely nothing about. My grandfather had always told me that a smart woman never puts her entire life into the hands of a man. I had taken his advice to heart, quietly building my own safety net while Terrence was busy building his ego. As the bellhop escorted me to the penthouse, I felt a profound sense of liberation. I walked into the sprawling suite, dropping my bag on the marble entryway table. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, a city built on hustle, ambition, and ruthlessness. I picked up the room phone and ordered a bottle of their most expensive red wine from room service. I walked over to the window and looked out at the glittering lights. Terrence wanted a war over assets, and he thought he had fired the winning shot by locking me out of my own home. But he was playing a game he did not understand against an opponent he had entirely underestimated. Tomorrow, I would not be making frantic phone calls to divorce attorneys. I would not be crying to my friends or begging for my clothes back. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. I was going to let him think he was winning. I was going to let him enjoy his empty house and his naive mistress. And then when he was completely comfortable in his arrogance, I was going to make sure he lost every single battle. I woke up the next morning enveloped in the crisp white sheets of the hotel penthouse. The Atlanta skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the early morning sun. My phone sat quietly on the mahogany nightstand. I had expected a barrage of angry text messages from Terrence demanding to know where I went or threatening me with legal action. Instead, there was absolute silence. He was playing a calculated waiting game. He believed that by ignoring me, he was starving me of attention, forcing me to sit in isolation and panic about my future. He assumed I was currently waking up on a friend's uncomfortable sofa, crying into a cup of cheap coffee, desperately trying to figure out how to afford a divorce attorney. I ordered a pot of dark roast coffee and a plate of fresh fruit from room service. While I ate, I opened my laptop and reviewed the screen captures I had pulled from his server the night before. The commercial development fund being overdrawn by $100,000 was just the surface level of his financial rot. I had spent 2 hours last night tracing the immediate domestic accounts. Terrence was drowning. He had taken out massive, high-interest loans against properties that were already leveraged to the absolute limit. He was actively moving money from incoming investor deposits to pay off the interest on older debts. It was a textbook financial hemorrhage, and he was using the facade of his luxury lifestyle to hide the bleeding from his board of directors. Just before noon, my phone finally illuminated with an incoming text message. It was from Terrence. He wanted to handle our separation like rational adults. He invited me to Sunday dinner at his mother's house in Cascade Heights. He wrote that we owed it to his family to sit down, mediate our assets amicably, and avoid dragging our private business into a public courtroom. I read the message and took a slow sip of my coffee. Sunday dinner at Mama Joyce's house was an institution in the Thornton family. It was not just a meal. It was a weekly performance of Black excellence, a stage where the family gathered to showcase their wealth, compare their achievements, and maintain the rigid hierarchy of their social standing. Mama Joyce ruled that dining room with an iron fist, turning a blind eye to the transgressions of her sons as long as the money kept flowing and the family name remained spotless in the local society pages. Terence claiming he wanted an amicable mediation was a blatant, transparent trap. He wanted me on his turf surrounded by his bloodline. He wanted to isolate me in a room full of people who would automatically take his side. He intended to use the combined weight of the Thornton family legacy to intimidate me into signing a rapid, quiet settlement. He wanted to pressure me into walking away from the marital assets before I had the chance to hire a forensic legal team to look at his books. He expected me to walk through those doors looking defeated, carrying the shame of a discarded wife. I spent 2 full hours getting ready. I did not dress like a woman who had just been locked out of her home. I opened the garment bag I had brought from my office the day before and pulled out my most intimidating tailored suit. It was a stark, brilliant white pantsuit with razor-sharp lapels, the kind of outfit that commands immediate respect and screams untouched credit limits. I paired it with a simple gold watch and nude stilettos. I applied my makeup flawlessly, highlighting the sharp angles of my cheekbones. I looked like a senior partner about to close a hostile takeover, not a woman mourning the end of a decade-long marriage. I picked up a single manila folder, placed a printed copy of his overdrawn commercial ledger inside, and slid it into my structured leather tote bag. I drove my car through the winding, heavily wooded streets of Cascade Heights. The neighborhood was steeped in old established money. The houses sat far back from the road, hiding behind towering oaks and manicured gates. I pulled into the wide circular driveway of Mama Joyce's sprawling brick estate. Terrence's least imported sports car was parked aggressively near the front steps. Beside it sat his older brother Malik's luxury sedan. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed the front of my white jacket, and walked up the stone pathway. I did not knock on the heavy front doors. I still carried my key to this house, a small brass symbol of my 10-year integration into their family unit. I turned the lock and pushed the door open, stepping into the grand foyer. The heavy scent of roasted sweet potatoes, baked macaroni and cheese, and perfectly seasoned fried chicken hit me immediately. It was the smell of a traditional Southern Sunday designed to project an atmosphere of overwhelming warmth and familial love. But the energy radiating from the back of the house was anything but warm. I could hear voices echoing from the formal dining room. There was loud, boastful laughter and the sharp clinking of heavy crystal wine glasses. I walked slowly down the hallway, the sound of my stilettos completely muffled by the thick, expensive Persian rugs lining the hardwood floors. I stepped into the wide archway of the dining room, and the laughter abruptly died. The scene laid out before me was staged with theatrical precision. Mama Joyce sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing her customary silk Sunday blouse, her expression a mask of practiced, unbothered neutrality. Malik sat to her right, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon with a look of mild amusement. Next to him sat his wife, Chloe. And there, sitting at the opposite end of the table, was Terrence. He was leaning back in his chair, wearing a casual designer sweater, trying to project the image of a man completely at ease with his life choices. But he was not alone. Sitting directly beside him, occupying the high-backed velvet chair that had belonged exclusively to me for the past 10 years, was Jasmine. She was wearing a tight, bright red cocktail dress that was entirely inappropriate for a Sunday afternoon family dinner. She was sipping from one of Mama Joyce's vintage crystal wine glasses, leaning her body aggressively into Terrence's personal space. An arrogant, victorious smirk was plastered across her face. Terrence had not invited me here for a dignified conversation about dividing our assets. He had invited me here to establish absolute psychological dominance. He wanted to publicly replace me in front of his family, humiliating me into total submission, so I would break down and quietly accept whatever meager allowance his lawyers offered. The entire room held its collective breath, waiting for my reaction. They expected me to yell. They expected me to demand to know why his 26-year-old assistant was sitting at a family gathering less than 24 hours after he locked me out of my own home. They wanted me to cause a scene so they could validate their narrative that I was an unstable, bitter woman who lacked the grace to handle a divorce. I did not raise my voice. I did not glare at Terrence. My eyes did not even fixate on Jasmine's smug, triumphant face. Instead, my gaze dropped directly to her wrist, resting casually against the polished edge of the mahogany table. Catching the light from the massive chandelier overhead was a thick, blindingly bright diamond tennis bracelet. It was not a cheap imitation or a generic department store gift. It was a custom piece featuring distinct emerald-cut stones, alternating with flawless round diamonds. It was my bracelet. It was the exact piece of jewelry I had purchased for myself with my own corporate bonus after closing my first major federal audit 5 years ago. I had left it sitting in my velvet jewelry box on my dresser at the Buckhead estate because I considered it too flashy for everyday wear. Terrence had not just moved his mistress into my home, he had allowed her to raid my personal belongings. He was actively letting her wear my hard-earned jewelry to his mother's house, parading her in front of me, like a prize he had won. The utter disrespect was staggering, but it was also incredibly revealing. He was so financially desperate that he could not even afford to buy his mistress a new gift to secure her loyalty. He was treating my assets like a slush fund to maintain his illusion of wealth. I did not point at the bracelet. I simply smiled. It was a cold, serene, completely empty smile that caused Terrence's confident posture to falter for a fraction of a second. I stepped fully into the dining room, pulling the manila folder from my leather tote bag. I walked past Jasmine as if she were completely invisible, refusing to acknowledge her presence in my chair. I bypassed the high-backed velvet chair, completely moving with a fluid, unhurried grace that immediately threw the room off balance. I did not slam my leather tote bag down. I did not throw my hands on my hips or demand an explanation for the young woman occupying my seat and wearing my diamonds. Instead, I walked straight to the opposite end of the long mahogany dining table, pulling out a heavy wooden chair that typically remained empty during family gatherings. I sat down, smoothed the immaculate creases of my white pantsuit, and placed my single manila folder perfectly parallel to the edge of the polished wood. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the scent of roasted meats and seasoned vegetables that sat untouched in their sterling silver serving dishes. Mama Joyce watched me from the head of the table, her jaw set in a tight, disapproving line. In her world, a wife was supposed to endure the indiscretions of a successful man with quiet dignity. She fully expected me to either erupt into a hysterical fit that would justify Terrence locking me out, or to lower my head and accept this mediation on their terms. My absolute calm was a variable they had not factored into their equation. Terrence cleared his throat, leaning forward in his chair. He laced his fingers together, putting on the deep, authoritative voice he used when speaking to difficult contractors. He was trying to project the image of a reasonable man dealing with an irrational woman. "I am glad you decided to be mature about this, Maya," he began, his eyes darting briefly to the manila folder before returning to my face. "We are all adults here. I asked you to come today because I want to handle our separation cleanly. My business is going through a transitional phase, and I do not have the time or the patience for a drawn-out public legal battle. I have drawn up a preliminary settlement agreement. It is more than generous considering the circumstances." He paused, waiting for me to take the bait. I simply looked at him, my expression completely blank. I did not look at Jasmine, who was aggressively shifting in her seat, deliberately resting her wrist on the table so the diamonds of my tennis bracelet would catch the light from the chandelier. She wanted my attention so desperately, but to me she was nothing more than a poorly dressed liability in a room full of bad investments. When I refused to respond, the tension in the room shifted and the spotlight eagerly moved to the one person who could never tolerate a moment of silence, Chloe. Chloe was married to Terrence's older brother, Malik. She was a woman who had spent the last 8 years desperately overcompensating for her presence in this family. As a white woman who had married into a wealthy, established Black family, Chloe treated her proximity to Black excellence as a personal achievement. She constantly sought validation from Mama Joyce, adopting the family's snobbery and weaponizing it against anyone she deemed beneath her. She had always resented me. I did not marry into wealth. I built my own. I did not spend my weekends at country club brunches. I spent them analyzing federal tax codes and dismantling corporate fraud. Chloe viewed my working-class background and my relentless work ethic as a personal insult to her lifestyle of leisurely consumption. Seeing that Terrence was failing to elicit a reaction from me, Chloe seized the opportunity to assert her dominance. She let out a soft theatrical sigh, reaching for the heavy crystal decanter sitting in the center of the table. She stood up slightly, her expensive silk blouse catching the light, and leaned over to pour a generous amount of red wine into Jasmine's glass. "It is just so refreshing to have some positive energy at the table," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She smiled warmly at Jasmine, treating the mistress of her brother-in-law with more respect than she had ever shown me. "You just bring such a bright, youthful energy to the family, Jasmine. Terrence has been so stressed lately. He really needs someone who knows how to support him, someone who understands how to make a house feel like a home instead of a corporate boardroom." Malik shifted uncomfortably in his seat next to her, staring down at his empty plate, but he did not utter a single word to stop his wife. Mama Joyce took a slow sip of her iced tea, her silence serving as a tacit endorsement of Chloe's behavior. Terrence smirked, leaning back in his chair, clearly enjoying the fact that his sister-in-law was doing his dirty work for him. I kept my hands resting lightly on top of my folder, watching Chloe perform. She was emboldened by the audience, thriving on the belief that I was currently homeless, powerless, and financially dependent on the men in this room. She topped off her own glass of wine and set the decanter down with a sharp clink against the mahogany table. "We all know you have always been a hard worker, Maya," Chloe continued, turning her gaze toward me. Her eyes were bright with malice disguised as pity. "And that hustle mentality is fine when you are just starting out. But Terrence is building an empire. He operates at a level that requires a certain kind of grace. He cannot have a wife who is constantly obsessed with spreadsheets and clocking hours at an office. It is just not a good look for a man of his stature." Jasmine let out a soft, mocking laugh, taking a sip of the wine Chloe had just poured for her. She adjusted her posture, puffing out her chest, emboldened by the validation of the family. "I know how to take care of a man," Jasmine chimed in, her voice entirely too loud for the formal dining room. "Terrence deserves peace when he comes home. He does not need a roommate, he needs a real woman." I let Jasmine's words hang in the air, refusing to legitimize her existence with a response. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Chloe. My silence seemed to agitate her further. She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to defend my career, to justify my presence in their elevated social circle, to prove that I was worthy of the Thornton name. When I simply continued to observe her with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a frantic lab rat, she decided to drop the veil of polite concern and go straight for the jugular. "You just never quite fit in with us, Maya," Chloe said, leaning forward, resting her elbows on the table. "You always approach everything with this desperate, grinding mentality. Terrence needs a woman who understands generational wealth, Maya, not someone who treats every dollar like she is still clipping coupons in the projects." The room went dead silent. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears. The insult was incredibly specific, designed to strip away my professional accomplishments and reduce me to the struggling girl from the South Side who had to work 3 jobs to pay for her accounting degree. Chloe sat back in her chair, a look of profound satisfaction washing over her face. She took a slow, victorious sip of her wine, fully believing she had just delivered the killing blow. Terrence let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if he pitied me. Mama Joyce carefully dabbed the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin, completely unbothered by the blatant disrespect occurring at her dining table. They thought they had broken me. They thought this coordinated, humiliating ambush would force me to open that manila folder, sign whatever lowball settlement agreement Terrence had drafted, and disappear quietly into the night. They truly believed that their combined wealth, their social standing, and their collective cruelty were enough to intimidate a woman who dismantled billionaires for a living. I did not break eye contact with Chloe. I did not blink. I slowly lifted my hands from the manila folder and rested my forearms on the edge of the mahogany table. I let the silence stretch for another 5 seconds, allowing the absolute delusion of their arrogance to fill every corner of the room. I was calculating the exact trajectory of the financial bomb I was about to drop on this table. I knew every account number. I knew every routing path. I knew the exact balance of the corporate card sitting in Chloe's designer handbag, just as I knew the desperate, fraudulent reality of the empire Terrence claimed to be building. They wanted to talk about luxury. They wanted to talk about generational wealth and clipping coupons. It was time to show them exactly who was funding their lifestyle. I kept my hands resting lightly on the manila folder. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact with Chloe. I let the silence stretch for another 10 seconds, allowing the absolute delusion of their arrogance to fill every corner of the room. I was calculating the exact trajectory of the financial bomb I was about to drop on this table. I knew every account number. I knew every routing path. I knew the exact balance of the corporate card sitting in Chloe's designer handbag, just as I knew the desperate, fraudulent reality of the empire Terrence claimed to be building. They wanted to talk about luxury. They wanted to talk about generational wealth and clipping coupons. It was time to show them exactly who was funding their lifestyle. Generational wealth. I repeated the phrase slowly, letting the words echo in the quiet dining room. That is a fascinating concept, Chloe. It is a beautiful narrative you have all constructed to justify your sense of superiority. But the fundamental problem with generational wealth is that it requires actual liquid capital to sustain it. Chloe's smug smile faltered just a fraction of an inch. Her eyes darted to Malik, seeking backup. But Malik was staring at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. I am not entirely sure what you think you are doing, Maya, Chloe said, her voice losing some of its artificial sweetness. But throwing a tantrum at Sunday dinner is not going to change the fact that Terrence is moving on. I am not throwing a tantrum, I replied, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly modulated. I am delivering a financial update. You see, Chloe, while you were busy practicing your country club etiquette, I was busy auditing the accounts that actually pay for your lifestyle. I know exactly how much Malik makes as a junior partner at his firm, and I know it does not cover the mortgage on your house, the private school tuition for your children, or the luxury vehicles sitting in the driveway right now. Malik sat up perfectly straight, his face suddenly draining of color. Maya, what are you talking about? I shifted my gaze to Terrence's older brother. I am talking about the fact that Terrence has been treating his commercial development fund as a personal slush fund to subsidize this entire family. He has been bleeding his own investors dry to maintain the illusion that the Thornton name still holds weight in this city. And because I built his corporate tax structure, I am the only one who knows exactly how the money moves. I turned my attention back to Chloe, leaning forward slightly. Speaking of how the money moves, Chloe, I noticed you drove your new Porsche Cayenne today. It is a beautiful vehicle, but the lease payments are not coming from Malik's checking account. They are set up on an automatic withdrawal tied directly to Terrence's primary commercial development account. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I froze that entire account 30 minutes ago, I stated clearly, letting each word land with the weight of a judge's gavel. I flagged it as a contested marital asset pending a full forensic financial discovery. The account is locked. The corporate cards are dead. Good luck at the dealership tomorrow morning when they try to run the scheduled payment and it bounces. The heavy crystal wine glass slipped from Chloe's fingers. It hit the edge of her porcelain plate and shattered, sending dark red wine spilling across Mama Joyce's pristine white lace tablecloth. The sound of the breaking glass shattered the paralyzed silence of the room. What did you just say? Malik demanded, his voice rising in panic. He turned to look at his younger brother. Terrence, what is she talking about? Is my car lease tied to your business accounts? Terrence's mask of unbothered arrogance completely disintegrated. The smug, relaxed posture vanished. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. He realized in that exact moment that I had not just locked his personal accounts. I had locked his business. I had cut off the oxygen supply to his entire fraudulent empire. You have no right to touch my commercial accounts, Terrence snarled, his voice vibrating with a sudden desperate rage. Those are corporate assets. You have absolutely no legal authority to freeze my business. I am your legal spouse, and I am the primary architect of the holding company that owns that fund. I replied smoothly, picking up my manila folder. I have every right to protect my 50% stake in the marital estate, especially when I have documented proof of financial mismanagement and gross negligence. I highly suggest you check your balances, Terrence. Though I suppose you already know you are currently overdrawn by $100,000. Jasmine let out a sharp gasp, her hand instinctively flying to her mouth. She looked at Terrence, her eyes wide with sudden terror. The illusion of the billionaire developer was crumbling right in front of her. She looked down at the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, suddenly realizing that the jewelry might be the only valuable thing he actually had left to give her. "You shut your mouth!" Terrence shouted, kicking his chair back so violently it crashed into the antique sideboard behind him. He lunged forward, placing both hands flat on the table, leaning over the roasted vegetables and fine china, his face contorted with absolute fury. "You think you can come into my mother's house and threaten me? You think you can freeze my money? I will destroy you, Maya. I will leave you with absolutely nothing." I stood up from my chair, my movements slow and deliberate. I looked at the man I had spent 10 years of my life supporting, defending, and building up. I saw nothing but a terrified broke man throwing a tantrum because his secrets had finally been exposed to the light. "You cannot leave me with nothing, Terrence," I said quietly, ensuring the entire room could hear me over his heavy breathing. "Because you have nothing left to take." I turned my attention to the head of the table. Mama Joyce was sitting perfectly still, staring at the spreading stain of red wine on her favorite tablecloth. Her perfect Sunday dinner was ruined, and the golden child she had protected for 37 years was currently being exposed as a fraud. "Thank you for the invitation, Mama Joyce," I said with perfect icy politeness. The food smelled wonderful. I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. I did not run. I did not look back. I walked down the long carpeted hallway with the steady, measured pace of a woman who had just won a war they did not even know had started. Behind me, the dining room erupted into absolute chaos. I could hear Malik shouting at Terrence, demanding to know if he was really broke. I could hear Chloe crying about her car. I could hear Terrence cursing, his voice echoing off the high ceilings as his carefully constructed world collapsed in real time. I opened the heavy front doors and stepped out into the warm, humid Georgia afternoon. The sun was shining brightly through the towering oak trees. I walked down the stone pathway, my white suit immaculate, my head held high. I reached my car, unlocked the doors, and slid into the driver's seat. I tossed the manila folder onto the passenger seat and took a deep, cleansing breath. The confrontation had gone exactly as I had calculated. I had stripped him of his audience, his pride, and his financial safety net all in one coordinated strike. As I reached to press the ignition button, my phone vibrated intensely inside my leather tote bag. It was not a standard text message notification. It was a high-priority encrypted alert tone that I had programmed specifically for the server tracking software I had installed the night before. I pulled the phone from my bag and opened the secure application. The screen illuminated with a string of data that made my heart stop for a fraction of a second. The alert was tied to Terrence's secondary investor fund, a pool of money consisting entirely of deposits from private backers who believed they were funding a new luxury condominium project in Midtown. I scanned the data lines rapidly, my professional training taking over. It was a wire transfer confirmation. Terrence had not just been sitting at Sunday dinner trying to intimidate me. He had been running a background process on his phone, attempting to liquidate whatever assets he still had access to before the domestic freeze fully locked him out. The transfer was massive. $2.5 million had just been successfully moved out of the domestic investor fund. I traced the routing numbers displayed on the alert. The money had not been moved to a domestic payroll account or a vendor. It had bypassed the standard corporate channels entirely. The funds had been wired directly to an offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, a shell corporation entirely disconnected from his legitimate business operations. I stared at the glowing numbers on my phone screen, my mind racing through the legal implications of what I was looking at. Terrence was not just overleveraged. He was not just terrible at managing his cash flow or spending beyond his means to impress a 26-year-old assistant. He had just committed federal wire fraud. He was actively embezzling millions of dollars from his own investors, moving untaxed, unregulated capital across international borders to hide it from the divorce discovery process and his creditors. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was securing a secret nest egg to fund his new life with Jasmine once the domestic dust settled. He had absolutely no idea that every single keystroke, every routing path, and every dollar amount was currently being captured, recorded, and logged onto my encrypted hard drive. I locked my phone and started the engine of my car. Terrence wanted to threaten me in his mother's dining room. He wanted to scream that he would destroy me. But as I pulled out of the circular driveway and drove away from the sprawling brick estate, I knew the absolute truth. Terrence Thornton had just dug his own grave, and I was going to be the one to hand the shovel directly to a federal judge. The glowing digits on my phone screen confirmed the wire transfer had successfully landed in a Cayman Islands shell account. $2.5 million effectively stolen from private investors who trusted my husband with their money. I sat in the driver's seat of my car outside Mama Joyce's estate and watched the digital confirmation lock into place. Terrence thought he was securing his future with his young assistant. He thought he was moving untraceable wealth across international borders to hide it from the inevitable division of our marital assets. He had absolutely no idea that his desperate late-night transaction had just triggered a silent alarm on my encrypted server. I did not panic. I simply saved the transaction logs, backed up the routing numbers to a secure cloud drive, and pulled away from the tree-lined neighborhood. I drove back to my suite at the Ritz-Carlton and ordered a late dinner. I slept for a solid 8 hours. It was the best sleep I had experienced in months. For years, I had carried the invisible weight of Terrence's massive ego and his fragile financial decisions. Now that weight was entirely lifted. I woke up the next morning feeling sharp, focused, and utterly ruthless. I put on a tailored navy blue suit, pinned my hair back into a sleek style, and headed to my downtown office. I am a senior forensic accountant for a top-tier firm. I spend my days tracking the phantom wealth of corrupt politicians and fraudulent executives. Terrence was about to become my most personal, meticulously documented case file. The retaliatory strike came exactly 3 days later. I was sitting in my glass-walled office, overlooking the Atlanta skyline, finishing a risk assessment for a federal client. The receptionist buzzed my phone to let me know I had a visitor in the lobby. I walked out to find a man holding a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was Maya Thornton. I nodded, accepted the envelope with a polite smile, and thanked him. I knew exactly what it was. Terrence was making his legal move. He was trying to regain the psychological high ground after the absolute humiliation I had handed him at Sunday dinner. I walked back to my desk, closed the heavy glass door, and sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. I pulled out a towering stack of legal documents printed on premium watermarked paper. It was a formal petition for divorce, filed by one of the most aggressive, obnoxiously expensive family law firms in the city. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and began to read through the initial filings. I fully expected Terrence to demand the Buckhead estate, the luxury vehicles, and a heavily skewed division of our mutual assets. I expected him to be greedy. What I did not expect was the sheer breathtaking audacity of his legal demands. Terrence was not just asking for a favorable split, he was petitioning the court for total control of the marital estate and demanding permanent spousal support from me. I read the paragraph 3 times to make sure I was not hallucinating. My husband, the man who leased foreign sports cars and spent $10,000 on charity gala tables to impress his 26-year-old mistress, was formally asking a judge to make me pay him alimony. I turned the page and read the justification his lawyers had so carefully crafted. According to the sworn financial affidavits attached to the petition, Terrence claimed that his luxury real estate development firm had suffered a catastrophic liquidity crisis due to unforeseen market conditions. He claimed that the recent shifts in the commercial real estate sector had completely wiped out his profit margins. The documents painted a tragic picture of a hardworking entrepreneur whose business had collapsed through no fault of his own. He swore, under penalty of perjury, that his corporate accounts were empty, His personal accounts were depleted, and he was currently operating at a massive, insurmountable deficit. He was officially declaring himself virtually bankrupt. Then came the pivot. The petition seamlessly transitioned from Terrence's manufactured poverty to a detailed, highly accurate breakdown of my corporate salary. His lawyers noted my status as a senior forensic accountant. They highlighted my consistent annual bonuses, my excellent credit score, and the stability of my career trajectory. They argued that because my income was reliable and lucrative, and because his business had supposedly failed, I was legally obligated to maintain the standard of living he had grown accustomed to during our marriage. They wanted me to fund his life. They wanted me to write him a monthly check so he could continue paying for his tailored suits and his mistress's expensive dinners. I dropped the heavy stack of papers onto my desk and let out a loud, genuine laugh. The sound echoed off the glass walls of my office. It was not a laugh of hysteria or heartbreak. It was the deep, resonant laughter of a woman who had just watched her enemy walk willingly into a fatal trap. Terrence had hired a team of ruthless, high-priced sharks to draft this petition. They had undoubtedly charged him a small fortune to construct this narrative of the impoverished, struggling husband and the wealthy, unyielding wife. But his lawyers only knew what Terrence had told them. They only saw the carefully curated financial ledgers he had provided. They saw the overdrawn commercial development account I had discovered the night of the lockout. They saw the mounting debts and the unpaid contractors. They thought they were representing a man who had simply fallen on hard times. They had absolutely no idea about the $2.5 million he had wired to the Cayman Islands. They had no idea he was actively embezzling money from private investors to hide his wealth offshore. Terrence had lied to his own legal team. In his desperation to punish me and protect his secret stash of stolen money, Terrence had signed an official notarized financial affidavit claiming he had zero liquid assets. He had sworn under oath to a Fulton County judge that he was broke. He had committed perjury in black and white ink, and I was holding the exact digital records required to prove it. I picked up my desk phone and dialed Valerie, the razor-sharp divorce attorney Elias had recommended to me earlier that week. Valerie was a veteran of high-conflict divorces, a woman who ate arrogant executives for breakfast and billed them for the privilege. She answered on the second ring. "Valerie," I said, keeping my tone crisp and professional. "I just received the divorce petition from Terrence's legal team. They are demanding the Buckhead estate total control of the domestic investment portfolios and permanent spousal support. They are claiming his business has suffered a catastrophic collapse, and he is insolvent." I heard Valerie let out a sharp, disgusted sigh on the other end of the line. "The absolute nerve of that man," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, combative register. "Do not worry, Maya. I have dealt with his firm before. They use aggressive opening petitions to intimidate the opposing party into a quick settlement. We are going to counterfile immediately. We will demand a full invasive forensic audit of every single business account he has touched in the last 5 years. I will drag him through discovery until he is begging to drop the alimony claim." "No," I replied smoothly. "We are not going to fight the financial affidavits." Valerie went dead silent. "Maya," she said slowly, as if she had misheard me, "you cannot be serious. If we do not contest his declaration of insolvency, the judge will accept his financial baseline. You will end up paying him alimony. You cannot let him establish that narrative." "I am not going to pay him a single dime, Valerie." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my mahogany desk. "I am a forensic accountant. I do not need a court-ordered discovery phase to find his money. I already know exactly where it is. If we demand a long, drawn-out financial investigation, Terrence will have time to panic. He will have time to move the offshore funds again, bury them deeper in another shell company, or launder them through dummy corporations. I do not want him to panic. I want him to feel incredibly comfortable." I picked up a pen and began tapping it rhythmically against a notepad. "I want you to file a response agreeing to an expedited settlement hearing. Do not contest his claim of bankruptcy. Let his lawyers think we are overwhelmed and trying to avoid a lengthy legal battle. Let Terrence believe his intimidation tactics worked. I want him to walk into that courtroom fully believing he has successfully hidden his assets and outsmarted the system. Maya, if he walks into that courtroom with uncontested affidavits claiming he is bankrupt, The judge will rule based on those documents, Valerie warned, though I could hear a spark of intrigue cutting through her professional caution. What exactly are you planning? Terrence just signed a legally binding document swearing to the state of Georgia that he has zero liquid capital. I explained, a cold smile forming on my lips. 3 days ago, I tracked a wire transfer of $2.5 million moving from his domestic investor fund to an offshore account in the Caymans. I have the routing numbers, the digital signatures, and the exact timestamps. He is running a Ponzi scheme, Valerie. He is stealing from his own investors to fund his lifestyle and hiding the cash from the divorce courts. I heard a soft intake of breath on the other end of the line. Valerie was a brilliant lawyer, and she immediately grasped the magnitude of what I was holding. If he testifies to that insolvency under oath while you hold proof of the Cayman transfer? Valerie murmured, the realization dawning rapidly. He is not just committing marital fraud, he is committing federal perjury. Exactly, I said. We are going to let him dig his own grave, and then we are going to hand the shovel directly to the judge. Agree to the expedited hearing, Valerie. Let him think he has won. I will handle the math. I hung up the phone and looked out over the sprawling city. Terrence wanted to play the victim. He wanted to use the legal system to drain my corporate salary while sitting on millions of dollars in stolen investor funds. He wanted to replace me with a younger, naive woman and force me to finance their new life together. He had meticulously planned my destruction. He simply failed to realize that I was the one writing the final chapter of his story. I walked into my favorite coffee shop in Midtown Atlanta the next morning, feeling more energized than I had in years. The morning rush was in full swing. Professionals in tailored suits stood in line checking their emails while the espresso machines hissed loudly in the background. I took my usual seat at a small corner table by the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had a cappuccino in one hand and a digital tablet in the other. I was already mapping out the data extraction parameters I would need to connect Terrence's fraudulent financial affidavits to his offshore transfers. My mind was sharp, entirely focused on the mechanics of his destruction. I was so engrossed in calculating the exact timeline of his embezzlement that I did not immediately notice the distinct sharp clicking of high heels approaching my table. Well, look who it is! The voice was loud, nasal, and dripping with an unearned sense of authority. I slowly looked up from my tablet. Standing directly across from me was Jasmine. She was wearing a skin-tight designer dress that was completely inappropriate for 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. She carried a massive logo-covered tote bag that screamed new money, and her oversized sunglasses were pushed back onto her head. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman desperately trying to perform wealth because she had never actually possessed it. She did not ask for permission. She simply pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down, crossing her legs and leaning forward aggressively. I did not flinch. I did not close my tablet. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my cappuccino and looked at her with the mild, detached curiosity one might reserve for a lost tourist. I am surprised you are showing your face in public, Jasmine said, her voice intentionally raised so the people at the neighboring tables would turn their heads. Several patrons in business suits glanced our way, their curiosity piqued by her theatrical tone. Terrence told me his lawyers sent over the divorce petition yesterday. You must be completely humiliated. I remained completely silent. My refusal to engage seemed to agitate her. She wanted a screaming match. She wanted me to look at her with jealousy and rage to validate the twisted narrative she and Terrence had created, where she was the young, beautiful prize, and I was the discarded, bitter burden. When I offered her absolutely nothing, she decided to amplify her performance. She reached her left hand across the small wooden table, planting it firmly right next to my coffee cup. Her fingers were splayed wide, and resting on her ring finger was a diamond so massive and aggressively cut that it bordered on ridiculous. It was a custom engagement ring featuring a center stone that had to be at least 5 carats, flanked by a halo of smaller diamonds. It caught the morning sunlight streaming through the window, throwing fractured rainbows across the surface of the table. It is a custom piece, Jasmine bragged, lifting her chin and flashing a smug, victorious smile. Terrence had it designed specifically for me, He said he finally wanted to give a ring to a woman who actually knows how to appreciate him. He is upgrading his life, Maya. You need to accept that. I looked at the ring. I did not see a romantic gesture. I did not see a symbol of love or commitment. My brain immediately shifted into the cold, calculating gears of a forensic accountant. I looked at the clarity of the stone, the custom platinum setting, and the sheer weight of the piece. That ring was not purchased at a standard mall jeweler. That was a high-end bespoke creation that easily retailed for $150,000. My mind flashed back to the legal documents sitting on my desk. Just 24 hours ago, Terrence had submitted a sworn financial affidavit to a Fulton County judge claiming absolute insolvency. He had stated under penalty of perjury that his business was failing, his accounts were depleted, and he had zero disposable income. Yet here was his mistress waving a six-figure diamond in my face. He had purchased a luxury asset while simultaneously crying poverty to the courts. The level of sheer, breathtaking stupidity was almost difficult to comprehend. He is taking half your retirement, Maya. Jasmine continued, leaning in closer, her voice dropping into a harsh, mocking whisper. His lawyers are going to drag you through court until you are completely bankrupt. You do not have the stamina to fight him. He is too powerful. Just sign the house over to us and walk away with your dignity while you still can. He might even let you keep your little savings account if you make this easy for him. She reached into her oversized designer tote bag to grab her phone, intending to check her messages while she waited for my reaction. She was careless. The tote bag was stuffed with makeup bags, receipts, and random items. As she yanked her phone out, a thick textured piece of cardstock was pulled upward, catching on the zipper and sticking out prominently from the side pocket. My eyes locked onto the card. It was not a standard receipt. It was a certificate of authenticity from a highly exclusive appointment-only jeweler located in the Buckhead Financial District. The card featured a distinct blue watermark, but what made my pulse steady into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat was the information printed clearly across the top edge. In bold black ink, I could plainly read the transaction ID number, the date of purchase, and the exact serial number assigned to the diamond. The date of purchase was exactly 3 days ago. It was the exact same day I had tracked the $2.5 million wire transfer moving from his domestic investor fund to the shell company in the Cayman Islands. The entire financial puzzle snapped together in my mind with perfect, undeniable clarity. Terrence had not just sent the entire sum offshore. He had skimmed a fraction of the embezzled investor capital, routed it through a domestic dummy account, and used it to purchase a bespoke engagement ring to keep his mistress compliant and distracted. He had literally bought her loyalty with stolen money, and she was sitting in a coffee shop displaying the physical evidence of his federal crime directly to the forensic accountant who was building the case against him. Jasmine noticed me staring at her bag. She quickly shoved the certification card back down into the depths of her tote, suddenly looking defensive. "You can stare all you want," Jasmine snapped, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "But staring is not going to change the fact that he chose me. He does not want you anymore, Maya. You are old news. You are just a stubborn woman standing in the way of our future." I slowly reached out and picked up my coffee cup. I took a calm, unhurried sip, letting the rich taste of the espresso ground me in the present moment. I looked at Jasmine. I did not see an enemy. I saw a profoundly foolish, temporary distraction who had just handed me the final nail for Terrence's coffin. "Jasmine," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly even. "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are sitting here wearing a dress you cannot afford, carrying a bag he likely bought on credit, and waving a ring that does not actually belong to him. You think you have won a prize. You think you have secured your future with a wealthy, powerful man." I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms on the table. My absolute lack of anger seemed to unnerve her. Her smug smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine uncertainty. "The man you are sleeping with is a mirage," I continued softly. "He is a walking liability dressed in a tailored suit. You came here today to tell me to walk away with my dignity. But you do not understand the game you are playing. I am not fighting him for the house. I do not care about the cars. I do not care about you. I care about the math. And the math says that ring on your finger is going to cost him everything he has left. Jasmine scoffed, though the sound was weak and lacked her previous bravado. You are just bitter. You are making things up because you are jealous. I am not jealous, Jasmine. I pity you. I picked up my digital tablet and stood up from the table. I smoothed the front of my jacket, looking down at her with absolute, unwavering authority. Because when the federal agents kick the doors down at his corporate office, and when the bank forecloses on that Buckhead estate you are so eager to live in, he is not going to protect you. He is going to panic and he is going to leave you holding the bag. I suggest you enjoy the diamonds while you can. The government will be seizing them shortly. I turned and walked away before she could formulate a response. I did not look back to see the expression on her face. I walked out of the coffee shop and stepped into the bright Atlanta sunlight. My mind was already cataloging the information. I had the jeweler's name, the purchase date, and the specific transaction ID. I had the exact parameters I needed to cross-reference his digital ledgers. Terrence thought he was running a brilliant, untraceable scheme. He thought filing a brutal divorce petition would force me into submission. He had no idea that his mistress had just provided the exact digital breadcrumbs I needed to link his domestic purchases to his international fraud. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, pulling out my laptop. I did not need to wait for a courtroom discovery phase. I was going to follow the money and I was going to burn his empire to the ground. I sat in my car in the coffee shop parking lot with the engine running and my air conditioning blasting against the heavy Georgia heat. I did not drive away immediately. I pulled my laptop from my leather tote bag connected to my encrypted mobile hotspot and opened a blank, secure spreadsheet. My mind was vibrating with a cold, relentless energy. I typed out the exclusive jeweler's name, the purchase date, and the exact transaction identification number I had memorized from the certification card sticking out of Jasmine's tacky, oversized designer bag. That single piece of textured cardstock was the loose thread on Terrence's impeccably tailored suit, and I was about to pull it until his entire carefully constructed garment completely unraveled. I put the car in drive and headed straight back to my suite at the Ritz-Carlton. I hung a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the heavy wooden door, ordered 3 pots of black coffee from room service, and set up a mobile command center on the massive mahogany dining table. I connected 2 portable monitors to my laptop. The real investigation was officially underway. The first night was entirely dedicated to isolating the domestic cash flow. Terrence thought he was a criminal mastermind, but arrogant men always leave a digital fingerprint when their ego is involved. I used my administrative backdoor to bypass his corporate firewalls and access his secondary commercial ledgers. I started with the date Jasmine's ring was purchased. I scanned the outgoing wire logs for that specific 24-hour window. I was looking for a sum of $150,000, but Terrence had not wired the money directly to the jeweler from his corporate account. He was trying to be careful. Instead, I found 3 separate transfers of $50,000 moving into a domestic holding company registered under a generic, unassuming name. I recognized the registration structure immediately. I had built similar protective shells for his legitimate assets years ago, but he had lazily copied my architecture to build a shadow account. I breached the shadow account in less than 20 minutes. The outgoing transaction history told a pathetic, desperate story. There was the massive payment to the high-end jeweler. There were exorbitant payments to luxury car dealerships, extremely high-interest personal loans from shady private lenders, and a staggering amount of cash withdrawn at local casinos. By the second night, my eyes were burning and my blood was entirely composed of espresso, but I did not stop. I had successfully isolated his domestic spending, but I needed to connect it to the massive $2.5 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands. If I could link the stolen money to his active investor pool, he would not just be facing a messy divorce settlement. He would be facing federal prison. I cross-referenced his active client roster with the incoming deposits hitting his primary development fund. I matched the investor names to the routing numbers. Terrence had recently secured funding from 3 major private equity backers for a luxury condominium project in Midtown Atlanta. The investors had wired millions into his corporate account, fully believing their capital was being used to secure building permits, hire exclusive contractors, and purchase premium building materials. I pulled the expense reports for the Midtown project. $0 had been paid to construction firms. $0 had been routed to the city for zoning permits. Instead, the incoming investor capital was being immediately siphoned off into his shadow accounts. The third night was when the entire horrifying financial picture finally crystallized on my glowing screens. Terrence was not just bleeding money due to bad business decisions. He was running an active textbook Ponzi scheme. He was using the fresh capital from new investors to pay the minimum monthly interest returns to his older, increasingly impatient backers. The rest of the money was being routed directly into his offshore shell companies to fund his lavish lifestyle and his desperate attempts to maintain his image of black excellence. He was paying old money with new money and skimming the cream off the top to buy custom-cut diamonds for his mistress. The level of financial deception was absolutely staggering. He was sitting at his mother's dining table bragging to his brother Malik about building generational wealth while actively defrauding the very people keeping the lights on in his corporate office. If the real estate market shifted even slightly, or if two investors asked for their capital back at the exact same time, his entire empire would collapse overnight. I did not feel sorry for him. I felt a profound sense of validation. I spent the next 12 hours formatting the raw data. I am a forensic accountant, which means I know exactly how to present complex financial fraud to a judge who might not understand the intricacies of offshore tax shelters. I translated the thousands of lines of code and routing numbers into a clear, undeniable narrative. I created sharp, color-coded flowcharts mapping the stolen investor funds directly to the Cayman accounts and to the custom engagement ring currently sitting on Jasmine's finger. I attached his sworn, notarized financial affidavits right next to the bank records, proving he had committed blatant, undeniable perjury. I printed the entire dossier on thick, heavy paper using the hotel's business center. I placed the documents into a thick manila envelope and sealed it securely with tape. I wrote a single label across the front. I called it the letter. It was Thursday morning. The sun was rising over the Atlanta skyline, casting a warm golden glow across my hotel suite. I showered, changed into a sharp charcoal gray suit, and picked up the sealed envelope. My plan was simple and devastating. I was going to drive to my office, officially retain Valerie as my legal counsel, and have her submit the dossier directly to the presiding judge under an emergency financial discovery seal. Terrence would walk into the settlement hearing expecting to dictate terms based on his fraudulent bankruptcy claim, and the judge would immediately hand him over to the federal authorities. It was a flawless, airtight strategy. I walked into the sleek, modern lobby of my accounting firm just before 9 o'clock in the morning. I greeted the security desk with a polite nod and took the private elevator up to the executive floors. I was exhausted from 3 days of relentless auditing, but pure adrenaline pushed me forward. I rounded the corner toward my glass-walled office, fully expecting to sit at my mahogany desk and make the final call to Valerie. Instead, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing directly outside my office door were two uniformed Atlanta police officers. Standing next to them was the managing partner of my firm, a man who highly valued absolute discretion and despised any form of corporate scandal. The managing partner looked at me, his face tight with deep concern and extreme displeasure. Maya, the managing partner, said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet, hushed hallway of the accounting firm. "These officers are here to speak with you regarding an urgent legal matter." One of the officers stepped forward, resting his hand casually on his heavy-duty belt. "Are you Maya Thornton?" he asked, his tone strictly professional, but carrying the undeniable weight of authority. "Yes," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, though my grip tightened instinctively around the leather handle of my work bag containing the sealed dossier. "We are here to serve you with a temporary restraining order," the officer stated, speaking loudly enough for several junior analysts to hear from their nearby cubicles. "It was filed late last night by a Terrence Thornton and a Jasmine Carter." You are to surrender your building access badge and any company equipment immediately pending a hearing. I felt the polished floor drop beneath me. The tactical brilliance of his dirty move hit me like a physical blow. Terrence had not just been sitting idly by while I built my case. He knew the one thing I valued more than my marital assets was my career. He knew that as a senior forensic accountant who handled highly sensitive federal cases, my security clearance was contingent on maintaining a spotless criminal and legal record. Any active police investigation or restraining order would immediately flag my federal clearance and render me a liability to the firm. He had filed a fraudulent restraining order claiming I was stalking him and his mistress. He was using the legal system not just to protect his stolen money, but to actively destroy my professional reputation. He knew my firm would be forced to suspend me until the matter was resolved. He was trying to cut off my income, strip me of my corporate resources, and humiliate me in front of my partners. He wanted to force me to surrender to his divorce terms out of sheer desperation. I looked at the police officers and then down at the sealed envelope hidden in my bag. Terrence thought he had checkmated me, but he had only guaranteed his own absolute destruction. I looked at the two uniformed officers standing in the polished marble-lined hallway of my accounting firm. The heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the nervous shuffling of junior analysts trying to peek over their frosted glass cubicle walls. The managing partner, a stern man who valued the firm's pristine reputation above all else, stood beside the officers with his arms crossed. His face was a mask of corporate preservation. Having law enforcement serve a senior forensic accountant in the middle of the executive floor was his worst nightmare, and Terrence knew it. The taller officer stepped forward, resting a hand casually near his utility belt, and handed me a thick stack of legal papers. It was a temporary restraining order filed late last night in Fulton County. I did not snatch the papers from his hand. I accepted them with a polite, measured nod, sliding them seamlessly into my leather work bag, right next to the sealed manila envelope containing the financial audit that was going to put my husband in a federal penitentiary. Maya, the managing partner, said, keeping his voice carefully neutral to prevent any of the eavesdropping staff from catching the details. You understand that given the nature of the high-level federal contracts, we handle any active police investigation or restraining order automatically triggers an administrative suspension. We have to revoke your security clearance and your network access until this domestic matter is fully resolved in a court of law. I need your badge and your company phone immediately. I did not argue. I did not plead my case or launch into a frantic explanation about how my husband was a fraud running a massive Ponzi scheme. In the corporate world, emotional explanations sound like guilt, and I refused to give the whispering spectators a show. I calmly reached into my tailored charcoal suit jacket, unclipped my secure access badge, and placed it directly into his outstretched hand. I retrieved my company phone from my pocket and set it gently on top of the badge. I understand the protocol completely, I said, projecting an aura of absolute professional grace. I will handle this fabricated matter swiftly and update the Human Resources Department the moment the court clears my name. I turned and walked toward the glass elevators. I did not look at my colleagues. I kept my posture immaculate, my chin high, and my stride perfectly paced. Terrence had planned this exact moment to be my ultimate breaking point. He knew exactly how hard I had worked to build my reputation in a male-dominated financial industry. He knew that as a Black woman from a working-class neighborhood, my career was my armor. By stripping it away in front of my peers, he expected me to crumble into a desperate, panicked mess. I reached the parking garage and slid into the driver's seat of my car. The heavy concrete walls blocked out the noise of the bustling downtown traffic. I placed my bag on the passenger seat and took a slow, centering breath. Right on cue, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently in the cup holder. I glanced at the screen. It was Terrence. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. He had been waiting for the exact moment I was escorted out of my building to strike. I pressed the answer button and put the phone on speaker, leaning back into my leather seat. "Hello, Terrence," I said, my voice completely devoid of stress or panic. I heard a low, victorious chuckle on the other end of the line. "You always thought you were so much smarter than everyone else, Maya," he said, his voice dripping with triumphant venom. How smart do you feel right now sitting in a parking deck because you just got marched out of your little office by the police? He was practically buzzing with adrenaline. He thought he had executed a brilliant, untouchable tactical maneuver. He had filed a fraudulent order claiming I was stalking him and Jasmine, knowing the family court would rubber stamp a temporary order out of an abundance of caution. He had weaponized the legal system to freeze my income and destroy my professional leverage. I told you that you are nothing without my protection. Terrence continued, his arrogance expanding to fill the dead air. You thought you could walk into my mother's house and threaten my business. You thought you could freeze my corporate cards and embarrass my family in front of my brother. But you forgot who you are dealing with. I built a luxury real estate empire. You just crunched numbers for a paycheck. And now you do not even have that. I let him talk. I let him feed his massive, fragile ego. Every word he spoke was a confirmation of his absolute desperation. He was trying to project the image of a powerful mastermind, but all I heard was a broke man terrified of an audit. I am a reasonable man, Terrence said, dropping his voice into a faux diplomatic register that he likely used to con his private investors. I do not want to see you completely ruined. I know how much that job means to a woman from your background. So I am going to give you a way out. My lawyers sent over the settlement agreement yesterday. You are going to sign the house over to me. You are going to relinquish any claim to my domestic investment portfolios. And you are going to agree to the spousal support terms I laid out. You sign the papers today, and I will call my lawyers and have the restraining order dropped tomorrow morning. You can go back to your desk and pretend none of this ever happened. You want me to surrender all marital assets and pay you permanent alimony, and in exchange you will stop lying to the police, I summarized, keeping my tone strictly analytical. It is a generous offer, considering you are currently an unemployed woman with an active restraining order against her. Terrence snapped the false diplomacy, vanishing instantly. Jasmine and I are moving forward with our lives. Do not make this harder on yourself than it has to be. Sign the papers, Maya. This is your last chance. I reached out and tapped the end call button on my digital dashboard. I did not give him the satisfaction of a response. I did not tell him to burn in hell or threaten him with exposure. I simply cut off his oxygen. I picked up the phone and dialed Valerie, the razor-sharp divorce attorney managing my case. She answered immediately, having already been briefed on the morning's developments by my mentor, Elias. Maya, Valerie said, her voice tight with professional fury. I just saw the temporary order hit the county docket. It is a completely fabricated retaliatory filing. We can get an emergency hearing to quash this by Friday. I will tear his legal team apart for filing a frivolous petition specifically designed to interfere with your federal employment clearance. No, Valerie, I said smoothly, starting my car engine and pulling out of the parking space. We are not going to fight the restraining order. What are you talking about? Valerie demanded, her usual composure slipping. If you do not fight the order, your firm will keep you suspended indefinitely. He is literally holding your career hostage to force a settlement. He thinks he is holding my career hostage. I corrected her, merging into the heavy Atlanta traffic. But he just handed us the exact mechanism we need to fast-track his destruction. If we fight the restraining order, we get bogged down in a petty battle over domestic harassment allegations. It will delay the divorce proceedings and give him time to move the rest of the embezzled investor money offshore. He wants to use this order to extort a fast, quiet settlement. I say we give him exactly what he wants. I navigated the busy intersection, my mind perfectly clear. Call his legal team right now, Valerie. Tell them I am completely devastated by the corporate suspension. Tell them I am panicking, that I am desperate to get my job back, and that I cannot afford a protracted legal fight against his resources. Tell them I agree to an expedited settlement hearing this week. You want to surrender? Valerie asked, her sharp legal mind already catching up to my strategy. You want them to think the intimidation tactic worked. I want to walk into a courtroom where Terrence feels absolutely invincible, I replied, staring at the road ahead. I want him standing in front of a judge, fully believing he has blackmailed me into total submission, armed with nothing but his fraudulent financial affidavits and his massive ego. Get us on the docket for this week, Valerie, and do not contest a single thing his lawyers demand. Let them build his pedestal as high as they want. It will just make the drop that much more fatal. I ended the call with Valerie and navigated the chaotic midtown traffic back to my hotel. Valerie did exactly as I instructed. Within 2 hours, she filed a formal response with the Fulton County Family Court. The response was a masterpiece of legal surrender. We did not contest the temporary restraining order. We did not file an emergency injunction to restore my access to the marital estate or demand immediate spousal support. Instead, Valerie submitted a motion agreeing to Terrence's request for an expedited settlement hearing. She specifically requested the earliest available date on the docket, citing my sudden suspension from work and my absolute lack of financial resources to endure a prolonged legal battle. It was the perfect bait. I could only imagine the celebration happening in the Buckhead estate when Terrence's high-priced lawyers received our filing. They had probably poured a vintage scotch and patted themselves on the back for a job well done. They thought they had successfully weaponized the justice system to crush a vulnerable woman. They assumed that losing my security badge and being escorted out of my accounting firm had triggered a total psychological collapse. To them, my rapid surrender was the natural, inevitable outcome of a working-class woman trying to fight against established generational wealth. They thought I was terrified of the impending poverty. The confirmation of their arrogance arrived on my phone the following afternoon. I was sitting at the mahogany dining table in my hotel suite, meticulously cross-referencing the offshore routing numbers, when my screen lit up. It was a text message from Chloe. She could not resist the opportunity to kick me while she believed I was permanently down. She needed to assert her dominance to remind me that she had successfully integrated into the wealthy Black family while I was being discarded like yesterday's trash. I opened the message. It read exactly like the performative, condescending nonsense she always spouted. "It is for the best, Maya. Terrence is moving in a different direction, and dragging this out would only hurt you more. You never really belonged in our world anyway. You will be much happier back where you started." I read the message twice, letting the absolute venom of her words wash over me. She was sitting in a luxury vehicle that her brother-in-law was paying for, with stolen investor funds, telling me I did not belong in their world. She thought she was securely anchored to a billionaire dynasty. She had absolutely no idea that the entire Thornton family empire was currently resting on a foundation of massive, unmanageable debt and federal wire fraud. I did not type a response. I did not block her number. I simply took a screenshot of her message and saved it to a secure folder on my encrypted drive. I wanted a permanent record of their cruelty for the exact moment their entire reality shattered into pieces. I turned my attention back to my portable monitors. It was time to finalize the weapon. I spent the next 6 hours compiling the raw data into a flawless, impenetrable forensic audit. A judge handles dozens of contentious divorces every single week. They are used to angry spouses making wild accusations about hidden money and secret bank accounts. I knew I could not just walk into the courtroom and claim my husband was running a Ponzi scheme. I had to prove it with absolute, undeniable mathematical certainty so clearly that a judge could not possibly look the other way. I structured the dossier like a federal criminal indictment. Page 1 was a direct copy of the sworn financial affidavit Terrence had just submitted to the court. It clearly displayed his signature, notarized and filed under penalty of perjury, claiming he had zero liquid assets and an operating deficit. Page 2 was the internal ledger from his primary commercial development fund, showing the account was overdrawn by $100,000. This established the false narrative he wanted the judge to believe. Page 3 was where the trap snapped shut. I attached the digital breadcrumbs provided by Jasmine at the coffee shop. I included the receipt for the custom engagement ring, complete with the exclusive jeweler's transaction identification number. Below that, I inserted the routing logs proving the ring was purchased through a domestic dummy account funded by misappropriated business capital. I mapped the exact flow of the money from the corporate ledger to the retail register. The final section of the dossier was the fatal blow. I laid out the exact tracing paths for the $2.5 million wire transfer. I matched the incoming deposits from his private Midtown investors directly to the outgoing transfer to the Cayman Islands Shell Company. I highlighted the date and the timestamp, proving he had initiated the offshore embezzlement on the exact same day he locked me out of our home. I tied it all together with a comprehensive executive summary, explaining the mechanics of his Ponzi scheme, detailing exactly how he was bleeding new investors to pay the minimum interest on his older over-leveraged debts to maintain the illusion of success. I exported the entire 80-page document into a single encrypted file. I called Valerie and instructed her to utilize a highly specific, rarely used legal mechanism. We were going to submit the dossier directly to the presiding judge's clerk under an emergency financial discovery seal. This was the critical component of my strategy. If we submitted the evidence through standard discovery channels, Terrence's legal team would receive a copy immediately. They would have time to review the documents and they would instantly panic. They would stall the hearing attempt to move the offshore funds again to cover their tracks and likely advise Terrence to invoke his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination to avoid federal charges. I did not want to give them a single second to prepare a defense. I did not want them scrambling for a plea deal before the hearing even started. By submitting the audit under an emergency seal for the judge's eyes only, I ensured that Terrence and his expensive lawyers would walk into the expedited settlement hearing completely blind. The judge would review the evidence in chambers right before we were called into the courtroom. Terrence would take the stand, swear under oath that his fraudulent bankruptcy claims were completely true, and he would do it directly in front of a judge holding the exact documents, proving he was committing a severe federal crime. Valerie processed the submission flawlessly. The clerk of the court confirmed receipt of the sealed envelope on Thursday afternoon. The trap was officially locked and loaded. There was no backing out, no settling out of court, and no last-minute family mediation to save his reputation. I spent my final night in the hotel suite, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city. The anxiety that typically accompanies a bitter divorce hearing was completely absent. My heart rate was steady. My mind was perfectly clear and unbothered. I thought about Terrence across town, packing his tailored suit for the morning, convinced of his absolute superiority. I thought about Jasmine likely picking out an expensive, inappropriate designer dress to wear to the courthouse so she could gloat from the gallery. I thought about Chloe and Malik comfortably sleeping in a house subsidized by stolen money, confident in their generational wealth. They all believed tomorrow was going to be a quick, clean victory. They believed the working-class girl had finally learned her place and had been successfully bullied into walking away with nothing. I took a slow sip of my red wine, watching the taillights of the cars moving along the highway below in the dark. They were about to learn a very hard lesson. Arrogance can buy you a lot of things in this world, but it cannot change the math. And a forensic accountant never ever forgets to balance the ledger. I woke up on the morning of the expedited settlement hearing with a level of absolute clarity that only comes from knowing the exact outcome of a war before the first shot is fired. I ordered a light breakfast from room service, ate it slowly while looking out over the Atlanta skyline, and turned my attention to my wardrobe. Today was not about looking like a grieving, discarded wife. Today was about looking like the executioner. I bypassed the conservative, muted tones typical for family court proceedings and selected a custom-tailored crimson-red suit. It was bold, highly structured, and completely unapologetic. I paired it with a pristine white silk blouse, a simple gold necklace, and black stiletto heels. I applied my makeup with military precision, highlighting the sharp angles of my face to project an aura of untouchable authority. I did not pack any heavy briefcases. I did not print out stacks of frantic highlighted emails or text messages. I had already delivered the single 80-page encrypted file to the judge's clerk under a federal emergency discovery seal. My hands were entirely empty, holding only a slim designer handbag, which was exactly the visual I needed to sell my performance of total overwhelming defeat. I left my hotel suite, handed my valet ticket to the concierge, and drove my car toward the Fulton County Courthouse. The morning traffic crawled along the interstate, but my pulse remained perfectly steady. The courthouse was a sprawling maze of polished marble floors, security checkpoints, and anxious people pacing the long, echoing corridors. I cleared the metal detectors and took the heavy brass elevator up to the 5th floor, the designated territory for high-stakes domestic litigation. As the metal doors slid open, the scene laid out in the hallway was exactly the theatrical production I had anticipated. Terrence had not come to the courthouse to quietly dissolve our marriage. He had come to host a parade. He was standing near the tall wooden doors of our assigned courtroom, wearing a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than the average car. He was flanked by three aggressively styled defense attorneys men who charged thousands of dollars an hour to intimidate opposing counsel into rapid submission. Two nervous paralegals stood behind them, struggling to balance four massive cardboard banker boxes overflowing with financial ledgers, tax returns, and asset declarations. It was a spectacular visual display of fabricated transparency. They had brought mountains of paperwork to drown the judge in numbers, hoping the sheer volume of their documentation would mask the massive glaring holes in his actual cash flow. But Terrence had not just brought his legal team, he had brought his cheering section. Jasmine was standing practically on top of him, clinging to his arm as if afraid he might evaporate. She had chosen a tight black designer dress that was entirely too short for a legal proceeding, accessorized with the massive fraudulent diamond engagement ring catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway. And standing just a few feet away holding a designer coffee cup and radiating petty satisfaction was my sister-in-law Chloe. She had actually shown up at a courthouse on a Friday morning just to watch a judge officially strip me of my lifestyle. Malik was nowhere to be seen, likely busy at his own law firm, trying to figure out why the corporate card paying for his wife's luxury vehicle had suddenly been declined. Chloe was flying solo, operating as Terrence's designated family witness to my downfall. I stepped out of the elevator, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The sound drew their collective attention. Terrence's lead attorney stopped speaking mid-sentence. Jasmine's smug smile widened into a full, victorious grin. Chloe took a deliberate step forward, positioning herself to ensure I saw her standing firmly on their side of the battle line. I did not break my stride. I walked directly toward the group, projecting an aura of serene, unbothered calm. I did not look at the towering boxes of fake evidence. I looked directly at Terrence. He stepped away from his legal team and moved to intercept me in the middle of the corridor, ensuring his lawyers could hear his performance. Jasmine trailed right behind him, like a loyal shadow. "You actually showed up," Terrence said, his voice dropping into that familiar, condescending register he used when he thought he held all the leverage. "I was half expecting you to call your lawyer and surrender over the phone. I guess you wanted to experience the humiliation in person." I stopped a polite distance away, resting my hands lightly on the strap of my leather handbag. "I noticed you brought your entire legal department." "Terrence," I replied smoothly, my voice completely devoid of the panic he was desperately searching for. "And an impressive amount of paperwork. You must have kept your accounting team up all night fabricating those ledgers." His jaw tightened, a brief flash of genuine anger cutting through his arrogant facade. "You are in no position to make accusations, Maya." His lead attorney took a half step forward, ready to intervene, but Terrence held up a hand to stop him. He wanted to handle this himself. He wanted to break me personally. "You are currently suspended from your job," Terrence stated, his voice dripping with authority. "You have an active restraining order against you. You are sitting here without a single piece of evidence to contest my financial affidavits. My legal team is about to walk into that room and legally strip you of the Buckhead estate, your domestic investment portfolios, and mandate that you pay me permanent spousal support." Jasmine let out a soft, mocking laugh. She crossed her arms deliberately, positioning her left hand so the custom diamond ring was directly in my line of sight. "You really should have just signed the house over to us when you had the chance." Jasmine chimed in, her voice echoing shrilly in the corridor. "Terrence told you not to make this harder on yourself. Now you are going to leave this building with absolutely nothing." I finally shifted my gaze to her. I looked at the cheap hair extensions, the inappropriate dress, and the stolen diamond. "You are standing in a federal courthouse wearing an engagement ring purchased with embezzled investor capital, Jasmine." I said, my tone as casual as if I were discussing the morning weather. "I highly suggest you enjoy the weight of that stone while you can still afford the manicures to show it off." Jasmine's mouth snapped shut. She looked confused, glancing quickly up at Terrence for validation. Terrence simply sneered, dismissing my comment as the desperate rambling of a defeated woman. Before he could launch into another monologue about his manufactured poverty, Chloe inserted herself into the circle. She took a slow sip of her coffee, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. "It is really sad that it had to end this way," Chloe said, dripping with artificial sympathy. "But you pushed him to this. Terrence is a visionary. He is building a generational legacy for this family. He needed a partner who understands how to operate in our world, not someone who constantly tries to control him with spreadsheets and budget restrictions. You will be much happier once you accept that you are always out of your depth with us." I turned my attention to my sister-in-law, Chloe. I replied, keeping my voice soft and perfectly modulated. "I am curious. Did you take a rideshare service here this morning? Or did Malik finally figure out how to pay for the Porsche lease using his own paycheck?" Chloe's pale face instantly flushed a deep mottled red. The smug satisfaction vanished from her eyes, replaced by a sudden flare of genuine unfiltered panic. She opened her mouth to retort, but no sound came out. She took a quick step back, suddenly finding the marble floor extremely interesting. Terrence let out a harsh, dismissive breath. "You can throw all the petty insults you want, Maya. It does not change the math. My lawyers have airtight financial declarations. You agreed to this expedited hearing because you know you cannot afford a prolonged discovery phase. You surrendered, and now you are going to pay the price for ever thinking you could humiliate me in my mother's house." I simply smiled. It was a cold, empty expression that seemed to unsettle his lead attorney, who was watching our exchange with narrowed eyes. The lawyer was a veteran of family court, and he knew that a woman facing absolute financial ruin did not stand in a hallway smiling unless she was holding a grenade. But Terrence was too blinded by his own ego to read the warning signs. He thought my calm demeanor was shock. He thought I was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his legal presence. "I did not bring boxes of evidence today, Terrence, because I do not need to bury the truth under a mountain of paper," I said quietly, looking directly into his eyes. "The truth is incredibly streamlined when you know exactly which offshore accounts to look at." For a fraction of a second, the absolute certainty in his posture wavered. A flicker of genuine doubt crossed his face. A sudden, terrifying realization that he might not have covered his tracks as perfectly as he believed. But his immense pride quickly squashed the instinct. He refused to believe a woman could ever outsmart him. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung inward. A uniformed bailiff stepped out into the hallway holding a thick clipboard against his chest. "Thornton versus Thornton," the bailiff announced, his deep voice carrying easily down the long corridor. "Judge Harrison is ready for you in chambers. All parties and legal counsel please step inside." Terrence's lead attorney immediately gestured for the paralegals to grab the massive boxes of fabricated evidence. Jasmine grabbed Terrence's arm, giving me one last victorious smirk as they began to move toward the doors. Valerie, my attorney, stepped out of the adjacent conference room, having just arrived from filing her final appearance paperwork. She walked up beside me, handing me a sleek leather portfolio containing absolutely nothing but blank legal pads. She gave me a sharp, knowing nod. We were walking into this hearing completely empty-handed, relying entirely on the sealed dossier already sitting on the judge's desk. As we approached the heavy wooden doors, Terrence slowed his pace, allowing me to catch up to him. He leaned in close, ensuring Jasmine and his lawyers were just out of earshot. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sharp metallic tang of his nervous sweat. "Last chance to beg, Maya," Terrence whispered, his voice vibrating with absolute malice. "You get down on your knees in there and I might just let you keep your retirement accounts." I stopped walking. I turned my head and looked at the man I had spent 10 years supporting. I looked at the architect of his own destruction, standing on the precipice of absolute ruin, completely oblivious to the fact that gravity was about to take over. I did not scowl. I did not clench my jaw. I gave him a brilliant, serene, completely unbothered smile. I stepped past him, pulling open the heavy courtroom door myself, and walked inside to take my seat. I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom and stepped into an environment designed entirely to intimidate. The Fulton County Family Court was a massive room paneled in dark oak with high ceilings that swallowed every sound. The air conditioning hummed loudly, keeping the space aggressively cold. I walked down the center aisle with absolute precision, my red-tailored suit acting as a beacon of unwavering confidence against the sea of gray and brown legal attire. I took my seat at the petitioner table next to Valerie. My hands were completely empty. I did not place a single notepad, pen, or file folder on the polished wood in front of me. I simply sat back, crossed my legs, and waited. Across the aisle, the defense table was a chaotic staging ground of manufactured panic. Terrence sat in the center of the storm, flanked by his 3 high-priced attorneys. They were frantically organizing the 4 massive cardboard banker boxes they had hauled into the room. They stacked thick, heavy binders labeled with financial years and corporate tax returns, intentionally building a physical wall of documentation between their client and the judge. Terrence leaned back in his chair, shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He truly believed that the sheer volume of his fabricated paperwork would overwhelm the court and force an immediate surrender. In the gallery directly behind him sat his dedicated audience. Jasmine had positioned herself in the front row, sitting perfectly straight so her tight black designer dress and the stolen custom diamond ring were fully visible. She wanted to ensure the judge understood she was the new upgraded reality of Terrence Thornton. 2 rows behind her sat my sister-in-law, Chloe. Chloe had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a look of profound satisfaction stamped across her pale face. She was practically vibrating with anticipation, waiting to watch the working-class accountant get formally stripped of her lifestyle and her dignity. A sharp knock echoed from the heavy door behind the bench. The bailiff instructed everyone to rise. Judge Harrison walked into the courtroom. He was an older black man with a reputation for absolute ruthlessness on the bench. He was a former federal prosecutor who had spent 20 years dismantling complex financial crimes before taking an appointment in family court. He did not tolerate courtroom theatrics, and he absolutely despised executives who tried to hide assets during a divorce. He took his seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked down at the overwhelming mountain of boxes stacked on Terrence's table. "We are here for an expedited settlement hearing in the matter of Thornton versus Thornton." Judge Harrison announced, his deep, resonant voice filling the cavernous room. "I see the defense has brought an entire library with them this morning." Terrence's lead attorney stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, solemn expression. "Yes, Your Honor. My client is facing an unprecedented financial catastrophe. We have brought comprehensive ledgers, tax returns, and corporate bank statements to demonstrate the absolute devastating collapse of his luxury real estate development firm." Judge Harrison looked over at Valerie. "And does the petitioner plan to contest these financial affidavits today?" Valerie stood up, her posture relaxed and entirely unbothered. "No, Your Honor. The petitioner does not intend to contest a single document the defense has submitted regarding my client's husband's current financial deficit. In fact, we waive our right to cross-examine his financial standing entirely." The entire defense table froze. Terrence's lead attorney blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off balance by our immediate, unconditional surrender. Terrence shot a quick, victorious look back at Jasmine in the gallery. Jasmine beamed, tapping her diamond ring against the wooden pew. They thought they had won. They thought the threat of my corporate suspension and the fraudulent restraining order had completely broken my spirit. "Very well," Judge Harrison said, his tone carefully neutral. "Call your client to the stand, counselor. Let us get this over with." Terrence walked up to the witness stand with the practiced grace of a man who believed he was born to rule the world. He swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, placing his hand firmly on the Bible. He sat down, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and prepared to deliver the performance of a lifetime. His lead attorney began the direct examination, lobbing soft, rehearsed questions designed to paint Terrence as a tragic victim of economic circumstance. Terrence played his part flawlessly. He spoke in a low, somber voice about the unexpected shifts in the commercial real estate market. He described the agonizing pain of watching the company he built from scratch slowly bleed capital due to rising interest rates and supply chain shortages. He explicitly stated that his primary commercial development fund was overdrawn, his credit lines were maxed out, and he was currently operating at a massive, insurmountable personal deficit. Then came the pivot. His attorney smoothly transitioned the questioning toward my career and my assets. Terrence suddenly found his righteous anger. He testified that while he was drowning in corporate debt, I was hoarding my lucrative salary as a senior forensic accountant. He claimed I was financially abusive, refusing to support his failing business while continuing to live a life of luxury. He looked directly at the judge, his face a perfect mask of betrayal and sorrow. "Your Honor," Terrence said, his voice thick with manufactured emotion, "I have lost everything I worked for. My business is bankrupt. My accounts are empty. I am simply asking the court for fairness. I am asking for full control of the Buckhead estate so I can liquidate it to pay my creditors. And I am asking for permanent spousal support from my wife's corporate income so I do not end up on the street. I have absolutely zero liquid assets left to my name." He had done it. He had looked a sitting judge directly in the eyes and sworn under penalty of perjury that he was completely undeniably broke. Judge Harrison listened quietly, taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad. He did not interrupt the performance. He let Terrence build his pedestal of lies as high as he possibly could. When the defense attorney finally concluded his questioning and sat down, Terrence looked over at me with absolute, unfiltered malice. He had executed his plan perfectly. He was waiting for Valerie to stand up and beg the court for mercy. Instead, Valerie simply leaned back in her chair and smiled. "No questions for this witness, Your Honor." Terrence stepped down from the stand, radiating total, untouchable victory. He walked back to his table, clapping his lead attorney on the shoulder. Chloe let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief from the gallery. Jasmine crossed her legs, flashing her diamond ring, her face glowing with the anticipation of moving into my house and spending my salary. Judge Harrison set his pen down. He looked at the mountain of boxes on the defense table, and then he looked down at his own desk. Sitting directly in the center of his blotter was the thick sealed manila envelope I had submitted through the emergency discovery channel the day before. "Mr. Thornton," Judge Harrison began, his voice dangerously quiet, "you just testified under oath that your business is entirely insolvent. You swore to this court that your commercial development accounts are empty and that you possess absolutely zero liquid capital. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Terrence replied confidently, standing up from his chair. "The market conditions simply wiped us out. I have nothing left." Judge Harrison picked up a silver letter opener. He slid it under the heavy wax seal of my envelope. The sound of the thick paper tearing echoed loudly in the silent courtroom. He pulled out the 80-page forensic audit I had compiled. He did not look at the financial affidavits Terrence's lawyers had submitted. He looked exclusively at my color-coded flowcharts, my transaction logs, and my meticulously documented offshore routing paths. The judge flipped through the first 5 pages. He read the executive summary. He looked at the screenshots of the overdrawn commercial account sitting directly next to the transaction identification numbers from the luxury jeweler. He traced the routing numbers connecting the domestic investor fund to the Cayman Islands shell company. The courtroom was completely still. The only sound was the rustling of heavy paper as Judge Harrison turned page after page of absolute undeniable federal fraud. Then it happened. Judge Harrison stopped reading. He took off his reading glasses, set them on his desk, and let out a laugh. It was not a polite, suppressed chuckle. It was a deep, booming, genuine belly laugh that shattered the formal decorum of the courtroom. The sound bounced off the dark oak paneling, completely startling everyone in the room. Terrence's lead attorney stiffened his professional instincts, screaming that something had gone terribly wrong. Terrence's confident smile faltered. Jasmine lowered her hands, suddenly hyper-aware of the silence pressing in around them. Chloe leaned forward in her pew, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. Judge Harrison shook his head, wiping a tear of amusement from the corner of his eye. He looked dead at Terrence, and the amusement instantly vanished from his face, replaced by the cold, hard fury of a former federal prosecutor. "Mr. Thornton, you just swore under penalty of perjury that you have zero liquid assets," Judge Harrison said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "But the emergency financial discovery submitted by your wife's legal team tells a very different, highly documented story. This forensic audit tracks a $2.5 million wire transfer moving from your domestic investor fund directly to an offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. And according to the timestamp on this document, You initiated that wire fraud exactly 4 days ago. All the blood instantly drained from Terrence's face. His skin turned a sickening ashen gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. But wait, Judge Harrison continued, flipping to the next page of my dossier. It gets better. This audit also tracks an unauthorized withdrawal of $150,000 from that same investor fund. The money was routed through a domestic dummy account and used to purchase a custom 5-carat diamond engagement ring from an exclusive jeweler in Buckhead. Oh, this is good. You stole from your own private investors to buy a ring for your mistress, and then you came into my courtroom and demanded alimony. The reaction at the defense table was instantaneous and violent. Terrence's lead attorney, a man who had built a lucrative career by staying strictly within the boundaries of the law, turned completely white. He realized in a fraction of a second that his client had lied to him, provided him with fraudulent financial ledgers, and used him to submit perjured affidavits to a sitting judge. The ethical and legal implications for his law firm were catastrophic. The lead attorney did not hesitate. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He began frantically shoving his legal pads and pens into his leather briefcase. The two associate attorneys immediately followed suit, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated panic. "Your Honor!" The lead attorney stammered, his voice shaking visibly. Defense counsel was completely unaware of these offshore transactions or the misappropriation of investor funds. "We must immediately move to withdraw as counsel for Mr. Thornton, due to an irreconcilable ethical conflict of interest." The three highly paid, arrogant lawyers physically stepped away from Terrence. They moved to the far edge of the defense table, desperate to put as much physical distance as possible between themselves and a man who was about to be indicted for federal crimes. Terrence was left standing entirely alone, surrounded by towering boxes of fake evidence, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking like a prison uniform. In the gallery, absolute chaos erupted. Jasmine let out a loud, horrified gasp. She looked down at the massive diamond ring on her finger, realizing with sudden, crushing clarity that she was not wearing a symbol of love and wealth. She was wearing stolen federal evidence. She instinctively grabbed her left hand, trying to hide the ring, her eyes darting toward the courtroom exits. Chloe looked like she was going to be physically sick. The reality of the situation crashed down on her performative artificial world. She realized that the money funding her luxury car lease, the money subsidizing her husband's lifestyle, and the generational wealth she constantly bragged about was entirely built on a massive illegal Ponzi scheme. Her entire identity was tied to a fraud. Terrence gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the judge in sheer terror. "Your Honor, I can explain." Terrence choked out, his voice cracking pitifully. "Those accounts are legitimate business restructuring funds. My wife is lying. She manipulated the server data." Judge Harrison slammed his gavel down so hard the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "You will be silent, Mr. Thornton," the judge roared. "You do not speak again unless it is to request a public defender. You came into my courtroom, submitted fraudulent financial documents, and attempted to use the legal system to extort your wife while actively embezzling millions of dollars from private citizens." Judge Harrison did not waste another second. He picked up his pen and began signing the final orders with aggressive, definitive strokes. "I am denying the defense's request for spousal support," the judge announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "I am striking your fraudulent financial affidavits from the record. Due to extreme marital fraud, blatant financial deception, and attempted extortion, I am awarding the petitioner, Maya Thornton, 100% of all domestic assets, including sole ownership of the Buckhead estate and all domestic investment portfolios." Terrence swayed on his feet, looking like a man who had just been struck by a high-speed train. He had walked into the courtroom expecting to strip me of everything I had worked for, and he was walking out with absolutely nothing. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued sealing the manila envelope and handing it directly to the armed bailiff standing beside his bench. "I am permanently dismissing the temporary restraining order filed against the petitioner, as it was clearly a retaliatory fabrication. And I am officially forwarding this entire forensic dossier, along with the transcripts of today's perjured testimony, directly to the Internal Revenue Service, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for immediate criminal review. We are adjourned." The judge stood up and walked off the bench. The heavy wooden door closed behind him with a loud, satisfying click. I remained seated at the petitioner table, my posture perfectly straight, my expression completely serene. I watched as Terence collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, as the reality of his total destruction set in. I stood up, smoothed the front of my crimson-red suit, and walked calmly down the center aisle. I did not look at Terence. I did not look at Chloe, who was currently hyperventilating in the second row. I walked straight out of the courtroom and stepped into the bright sunlit hallway. I had promised him a war, and I had delivered an absolute massacre. The fallout from the hearing was swift, brutal, and incredibly public. 3 weeks later, my morning newsfeed lit up with breaking alerts. A team of federal agents had raided Terrence's corporate offices in Midtown Atlanta. The footage showed agents carrying out boxes of hard drives and financial records. Terrence was escorted out of his building in handcuffs, his tailored suit wrinkled, his arrogant smile permanently erased. He was formally indicted on 24 counts of federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Jasmine abandoned him the exact second the federal government froze all of his remaining offshore accounts. She tried to pack her bags and flee the Buckhead estate, but she did not get very far. Federal agents intercepted her in the driveway and legally confiscated the custom 5-carat diamond engagement ring directly off her finger, logging it as evidence purchased with stolen investor capital. She was left standing on the cobblestones with nothing but her cheap designer knockoffs. Chloe and Malik faced their own devastating reality. The federal investigation revealed that their luxury lifestyle was deeply entangled in Terrence's fraudulent corporate web. Because their leased vehicles and their mortgage were tied to his business accounts as collateral, the banks moved swiftly to protect their assets. I received a highly satisfying text message from a mutual acquaintance detailing how a repossession tow truck showed up at Chloe's house during a neighborhood brunch and hauled her Porsche Cayenne away right in front of her country club friends. Malik was currently facing intense scrutiny from the partners at his law firm due to the public scandal surrounding his family name. As for me, the dismissal of the fraudulent restraining order cleared my record instantly. The managing partner of my accounting firm called me the very next day. He offered a profound, groveling apology for the public suspension and begged me to return to the office. I told him I would gladly return, but I was no longer interested in remaining a senior analyst. I demanded a full partnership in office on the executive floor, and a substantial increase in my base salary to compensate for the severe professional distress they had caused me. He agreed to my terms before I even finished outlining them. I did not move back into the Buckhead estate. I had the massive stone house professionally cleaned, staged, and immediately placed on the market. I sold it to a foreign investor for millions in cash, adding the funds directly to my rapidly expanding personal portfolio. I wanted absolutely nothing tying me to the memory of a man who thought my hard work was something he could exploit and discard. I took my time finding a new home. I purchased a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse condominium in the heart of the city. I paid for it entirely in cash, using money I had earned, saved, and invested myself. I decorated the space exactly as I wanted it, filling it with vibrant art, plush furniture, and an atmosphere of absolute untouchable peace. On a quiet Friday evening, I walked out onto the massive wraparound balcony of my new penthouse. The Atlanta skyline stretched out before me, a sea of glittering lights and endless possibilities. The heavy, suffocating humidity of the summer had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, cool breeze. I wore a comfortable silk robe and held a glass of incredibly expensive red wine in my hand. I took a slow sip, letting the rich, complex flavors settle on my tongue. I looked down at the city where I had built my career, survived a massive betrayal, and ultimately engineered the complete destruction of a man who tried to bury me. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel bitter. I felt a profound, unshakable sense of freedom. Terrence thought he could use my dedication, my loyalty, and my financial brilliance to build his empire, and then throw me away when he found a younger distraction. He thought he was the smartest person in every room he entered. He forgot the most important rule of business and life. You never ever try to outsmart the woman who handles the math. The greatest lesson from this ordeal is that true power does not reside in loud arrogance or performative wealth, but in quiet competence and absolute independence. When someone tries to diminish your worth or strip away your dignity, you must not allow their delusion to become your reality. Always maintain your own safety net, trust your instincts, and never shrink yourself to protect a fragile ego. Terence thought his status made him untouchable, completely forgetting that the people who build the foundation are also the ones equipped to tear it down. True security is built on substance, not illusion. If this story of reclaiming your power resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share your own experiences of standing strong against betrayal in the comments below.